Hey guys, tonight we're exploring why medieval villagers painted their houses with milk. A reality so strangely practical and quietly beautiful, it feels almost mythical. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of quiet historical storytelling. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always lovely to see who's joining in. Maybe with a blanket and a late-night cup of tea. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine walking through a village at dusk in the early 14th century. The sun has dipped low behind the trees, casting long, soft shadows across dirt paths and tiny garden plots. There's a gentle hush in the air, the kind that wraps the world in velvet just before night takes hold. A cow bellows from behind a hedge, and somewhere, the hollow clink of a pail touches the breeze. Now, if you glance at the cottages lining this sleepy road, something curious might catch your eye. Their walls gleam faintly, just a shimmer, like dew in moonlight. Not glass, not metal, something softer, creamier. A pale luster baked into the very surface of their homes. That glow? It's milk. Well, not fresh milk exactly, but a mixture made with it. A substance known as lime wash, a blend of slaked lime and water. Villagers learned that this humble mixture, brushed lovingly over wattle and daub or rough stone, could do more than just lighten a home's appearance. It preserved it. You see, medieval homes weren't made to last centuries. They were meant to survive a storm, a damp winter, or the relentless gnaw of pests. Walls of woven sticks, packed with mud and straw, needed protection. And lime wash, chalky, breathable, gently antiseptic, offered just that. When villagers added milk to the lime wash, they didn't do it to be artistic. They did it because milk proteins, when dried and cured into lime, hardened into a protective layer that clung like skin. It resisted water, discouraged mold, and even deterred insects. A practical magic, brewed in clay buckets beside the hearth, stirred with wooden spoons by hands that knew the rhythms of a hard and honest life. There was something beautiful about it too. Freshly applied, the mixture was chalk white, radiant even on grey days. Over time it mellowed, softening into ivory or pale rose where iron seeped from the earth. Some villagers, especially in southern France and the Tyrol, even tinted their milk paint with natural pigments, burnt ochre, brick red, or faded greens from crushed nettle or copper scraps. But no matter the hue, the ritual was the same. Every spring, just after the first frost gave way to tender shoots, families would repaint. It was part maintenance, part celebration, a way to greet the sun and tidy up the wrinkles of a hard winter. Children would help, their fingers streaked with drips of curdled white as they daubed corners or chased chickens through puddles. Grandparents watched from shaded benches, nodding with approval or quietly correcting technique. And always, a kettle boiled on the fire, ready to reward the day's work, with broth, bread, or if luck was kind, a custard made from the same milk used on the walls. To us, it might sound strange, using food to paint a house. But in the medieval world, there was no such thing as waste. Everything had its place. Even spoiled milk, too far gone for porridge, but still useful when boiled with lime and soapwort, could find new purpose in preserving the home it once helped nourish. And maybe that's the quiet lesson hidden here, that the villagers didn't just live in their homes, they cared for them, brushed their walls with the same tenderness they gave to bread dough or fire embers. Their cottages weren't just structures. They were living companions. And milk so ordinary, so comforting, became their way of saying, "I see you. I'm keeping you safe." Tonight, as stars begin to blink awake above the quiet village lanes, the milk-painted houses stand calm and still. Their gentle glow a lullaby in lime and stone. Their walls whispering stories to the wind. Stories will follow next, as we step inside one of these homes and learn just how much a painted wall could protect not just from rain or rot, but from memory itself. Inside a medieval cottage, the air held layers scented with peat smoke, dried herbs, and the faint tang of milk lime from the walls. Not unpleasant, just old, seasoned, like the inside of a bread oven that had seen hundreds of loaves. These weren't homes made to impress. They were made to survive and to hold memories. The moment you stepped through the low wooden doorway, you entered a kind of hush. The thick walls, coated in lime and casein, muffled outside noise. Birds still sang beyond the garden gate, roosters crowed, and carts creaked past on the lane. But here it all arrived, softened, filtered through chalk and wood and thatch. It made the inside of the house feel safe, private, a quiet belly within the noisy world. This was one of the secrets of lime and milk. The way it didn't just sit on a wall, but became the wall. It sunk into every cranny of the daub, sealing it gently, forming a crust that could breathe, letting moisture out while keeping rot and insects at bay. And it did something else too, something less tangible. It gave the rooms a lightness, a hush. Even in winter, when sunlight was a brief and unreliable visitor, these walls held a kind of glow. In the flickering light of a tallow candle or hearth fire, they shimmered faintly pearlescent, like the inside of an oyster shell. In summer, they bounced daylight from narrow windows and made the whole room feel cooler, fresher. If you were a child growing up in one of these homes, the walls were more than walls. They were canvas, diary, chalkboard. During idle hours, your finger might trace spirals into the surface, feel the powdery grit on your skin. Or your mother might use soot and a wetted stick to mark measurements directly onto the plaster. A line for your height, a quick calculation, a scratched-in blessing when the new baby came. The milk-bound lime wash took it all, held it, wore it gently like old cloth holds the scent of hearth smoke. That was part of why villagers repainted every year. Not only to preserve, but to refresh. To cover the old with the new. To reset the story while still keeping what lay beneath. Lime layers weren't scraped away. They stayed, building up over time, like the rings inside a tree trunk. A chronicle of seasons written in casein and chalk. No one thought much of this at the time. It wasn't symbolic, not consciously. But over generations, a cottage painted faithfully with milk and lime became more than shelter. It became memory. Elderly women, their backs bowed by decades of work, might pause before repainting a section of wall and murmur, "This was where we kept the butter trough, before the fire." Or a young bride, moving into her new home, might run her hands along the window frame and whisper, "My grandmother was born in this room." Milk-painted walls held onto things. Not just moisture and warmth, but moments, laughter, prayer. The quiet creak of a lover's footsteps across the floorboards at dawn. Even the act of painting itself became a ritual. There were no professional crews, no contractors. The whole family joined in. Men fetched lime and water, hauling heavy buckets from the common well. Women stirred the mixture, adding the milk carefully, sometimes warm from the cow, sometimes clabbered from the day before. Children dipped brushes or old rags and reached for the lowest stones. The brushes weren't fancy. Some were bundles of straw tied with string, others were made from horsehair or the stiff bristles of pig hide lashed to a stick. The goal wasn't smooth perfection, it was thoroughness. Every crack, every join, every shadowed corner received its milky blessing, and when the sun shone and the whitewash dried, the whole house gleamed, a small miracle in a world of grime and labour. Of course, not all milk paints were the same. Recipes varied from village to village, even from family to family. Some added linseed oil for durability, others mixed in egg yolk, making a kind of medieval tempera. In regions where milk was scarce, villagers might use curds instead of cream, or collect whey from cheese making. In alpine towns, they often included bits of pine resin or wax to help the paint survive long winters. In warmer climates, Crushed petals were sometimes added lavender, calendula, or even dried rose. These didn't survive long, faded by weather and time, but for a few glorious days each spring, walls would bloom with subtle colours, like morning frost catching light on a meadow. In the Baltics and parts of Scandinavia, birch tar was occasionally stirred into the mix, turning the whitewash into something smoky and amber-toned, with a scent like old forests and rain. In the warmer corners of Spain, villagers sometimes sealed their walls with a final glaze of olive oil and salt, a practice learned from Moorish builders who understood how to keep heat out and stories in. But no matter the variation, milk was always at the heart of it. Milk. That ancient food. That first comfort. It made perfect sense. A substance tied to nurture, to softness, to life itself, becoming the protector of a home. Who better to guard the walls than something born of care? There's poetry in that. But there's also practicality. Lime, on its own, could be harsh, caustic. It could crack or crumble, but milk softened it, made it pliable, kind, a mixture that could bond to clay or stone without breaking them down. And perhaps, unconsciously, that's why villagers trusted it so much. It mirrored the way they lived. Toughness, softened by gentleness. Harshness made tolerable through care. As the fire burned low each evening, and the walls glowed faintly in the shadows, families sat close. They told stories. They mended things. They rested in the quiet certainty that these walls, white, humble, quietly breathing, would keep the wind out, the damp down, and the memories in. Outside, the milk-painted cottages gleamed beneath the stars. Dozens of them, scattered across hills and meadows like old teeth in the mouth of the land. Weathered, patient, luminous in moonlight. And all of them, every single one, had been touched by the same strange, tender magic. The magic of milk. And tomorrow, we'll follow a different thread. We'll visit a monastery where milk was not just for walls, but for scrolls, ink, and ancient recipes passed from scribe to scribe. Because milk in the Middle Ages was far more than food. It was foundation, ink, paint, and, as we'll see next, knowledge. We continue our journey through the quietly brilliant world of medieval milk, and this time, we're entering the stone corridors of a monastery where silence reigned, quills scratched faintly, and milk took on a scholarly, sacred form. Imagine the hush of an early morning in a 12th century scriptorium. Outside, mist clings to the grass, and the cloistered garden smells faintly of rosemary and damp earth. Inside, the air is cool, shaded from the rising sun, and heavy with the scent of ink, beeswax, and vellum. Long tables stretch across the chamber. Quills, plucked from geese and sharpened with penknives, are stacked neatly beside ink pots. Monks in woolen habits move silently, adjusting candles, unrolling scrolls, and preparing to copy texts that, if they're lucky, will take a year to complete. Among these sacred tools sits something humble, a clay vessel, pale, modest. Inside it, a mixture of warm milk, vinegar, and oak gall. It doesn't look like much, but it is. This is ink. In the medieval world, before mass-produced dyes and factory pigments, everything came from the land. And milk, so versatile, so abundant, played a quiet role in turning knowledge into permanence. Here's how it worked. To make ink, scribes often began with gall nuts, the odd little growths found on oak trees where wasps laid their eggs. These galls, rich in tannic acid, were crushed and steeped in rainwater or vinegar. The liquid turned dark, rich, slightly astringent. A good base. Then came iron scrapings from nails, filings from tools, or rusted flakes gathered from hinges and horseshoes. Mixed with the tannic liquid, it reacted, forming a deep black stain known as iron gall ink. But here's where milk entered the equation. A few clever scribes discovered that adding a bit of curdled milk or whey helped stabilize the mixture. The proteins in milk casein again acted like a gentle binder, helping the ink adhere to parchment, resist smudging, and dry with a soft sheen. In some monasteries, particularly in Northern Europe, scribes even created entire inks using casein as the base, mixing it with soot, wine, and vinegar. The result was an ink that didn't just stain the page, it settled into it. Permanently, softly, like a whispered prayer sealed in skin. And that was important. Because these pages mattered. The monks weren't writing grocery lists or letters home. They were copying psalms, legal records, astronomy tables, herbals, poems, prayers. Each page took hours, days, sometimes weeks. Every letter had to be perfect. Every line aligned. Mistakes weren't erased, they were scraped off gently with a blade, and then rewritten. But too many scratches weakened the parchment, so the ink had to work right the first time. And milk helped. Of course, monks used milk for more than ink. In many monasteries, milk fed the sick and the elderly. It was used in poultices, poured over barley to create soft gruel, or warmed with honey to ease sleep. It helped produce cheese, which could be stored for months, and butter, which was reserved for feast days, or sold at market. But in the scriptorium, milk did something different. It made knowledge last. Some manuscripts from the 1102 still bear traces of milk-based ink, tiny glosses in the margins, delicate footnotes that shimmer faintly under candlelight. These notes, often scribbled in secret by junior monks or visiting scholars, weren't meant to last forever, but they did, thanks to milk, and the parchment itself also milk-touched. In a way, real parchment, called vellum, was made from calf skin, not paper, and to make vellum, the hides were soaked, stretched, scraped and dried, until they became translucent sheets of incredible strength and delicacy. The best vellum had a smoothness like polished bone, a surface that almost begged for ink, and the finest of these sheets came from young animals' milk-fed calves. Their skin, unblemished and soft, produced pages so clean they seemed almost sacred. Monks believed that copying sacred texts required sacred materials, and so, in a strange and solemn way, milk-fed creatures helped preserve the Word of God. The milk that once nourished life now preserved wisdom. Century after century, it's easy to forget. In our world of keyboards and screens, how much effort once went into preserving thought? How many hands touched a single page? How many mornings passed in silence? Each letter formed with devotion, each stroke of the quill made smoother by a touch of curdled milk. And perhaps, beneath it all, there was something symbolic in this. Milk is the first nourishment, the first thing we taste. It's what binds us to mothers, to childhood, to the memory of being small and cared for. So when scribes used it to fix ink to vellum, to preserve sacred songs and stories, maybe they were without knowing tapping into that same bond, nurturing words the way a mother nurtures a child, feeding meaning into the future. And when those monks stood to stretch their backs, brush dust from their robes, and take their simple supper, maybe bread, maybe cheese, maybe a bowl of hot milk steeped with herbs, they knew that something precious had been passed forward. Not just information, but care. Later that evening, as bells tolled softly through the stone halls, and the candles guttered low, the pages they'd written would lie curled under wooden presses, drying slowly, ink sinking in, their milk-born lines quiet, waiting for eyes yet unborn, for readers who would never know their names. For us, and tomorrow we'll step from these cloisters and follow milk into the kitchens and courtyards, where it softened more than parchment, where it helped villagers clean, mend, and even dye cloth in shades so delicate they could vanish with a single rain. Because milk, in the Middle Ages, wasn't just food, it was thread, ink, paint, memory, and as we'll see next, it was fabric. We're continuing our exploration into the surprising uses of milk in the Middle Ages, this time slipping past the threshold of the monastery into the homes and dye pots of everyday villagers, where milk was no longer just for drinking or painting walls, but for something softer and strangely enduring. We're talking about fabric, or more precisely, how milk helped make fabric last. It's easy to forget, in a world of fast fashion and synthetic fibres, just how precious fabric once was. In medieval villages, every piece of cloth mattered. A tunic might be worn for years. A single length of linen could be passed down, patched, re-dyed, and repurposed into everything from a headscarf to a baby's swaddling to a dish rag. Cloth wasn't just useful, it was wealth, it was labour, and in many ways, it was identity. And here, too, milk had its quiet role to play. Let's step into a typical cottage in the 1302nd. The fire is low but steady, casting warm light across rough wooden beams. Bundles of herbs hang drying near the hearth. A cat stretches in the corner, tail flicking, and on a low bench near the door, a woman stirs something thick and pale in a wide ceramic basin. It's not stew. It's a fixative, a blend of soured milk and lye, maybe with a little clay or chalk added. And into it, she's dipping yarn homespun wool or flaxen thread, twisted carefully, washed clean of lanolin and dirt. Why? Because if she plans to dye this thread, if she wants it to hold the colour from her elderberry skins, her madder roots, or her onion husks, she needs that colour to stick. And milk helps. More specifically, it's the casein, the same milk protein that helped preserve walls and fix ink. When used as a mordant or binding agent in dyeing, it allows pigments to grip the fibres more securely. Without it, dyes might run or fade with the first wash or rain. With it, the colour bonds more tightly, more faithfully. And while not every village had access to alum, the preferred mordant of professional dyers, almost every cottage had milk, especially the slightly off milk. The clabbered, tangy, thick bottom of the pale milk that was no longer safe for drinking but perfect for textiles. Nothing was wasted. Even the curds had a job. Sometimes, after dyeing, villagers would dip their finished cloth in a milk solution to set the colours. Other times, they might use milk and flour together to stiffen collars or shape garments, especially for feast days or marriages. A peasant bride's chemise, starched just slightly with a milk paste, might hold its shape better under a woolen overdress. Children's caps, too stiffened with the same mixture, framed round faces for village portraits and holy days. And there's more. In parts of Europe, particularly along the edges of the Alps and in forested Bohemian villages, milk was used to soften fabric. Fresh woven linen, sometimes called raw cloth, could be harsh on the skin, scratchy, prone to wrinkling. But if soaked briefly in a diluted milk bath, then dried in the sun and pounded with wooden mallets, the fabric became more pliable, more wearable. The same principle was used for wool. A newly woven woolen shawl might be stiff or coarse, but soak it in warm milk with a little soapwort or stale urine. Rinse, then dry, and it took on a new softness. A gentle nap, like it had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. You can almost imagine the rhythm of it, the soft slap of cloth against stone, the hush of wind through garden hedges, the sun overhead drying milk-sweet fibres until they smelled faintly of meadow and warmth. Of course, milk wasn't just for domestic textiles. Professional dyers in cities like Florence, York, and Prague knew its value. In their ledgers, neat, inked lines copied by apprentices, you'll sometimes find notes. Use new milk for sky blue, or milk set crimson holds better in damp. These weren't decorative luxuries. These were commercial secrets. A cloak that held its colour longer fetched a higher price. A gown that didn't bleed dye onto its wearer's skin was favoured by nobility and merchant wives alike. Milk meant durability, and in a world where even soap was precious, that mattered. It's worth noting that milk-treated fabrics aged differently too. Cloth that had been soaked or sized with milk often developed a distinctive patina. A certain way of catching light in the folds. Over years of wear, it didn't fray the same way untreated fabric did. It wore softer. Edges curled, not cracked. Sleeves grew thin with use, not torn. There are even accounts, rare but compelling, of ecclesiastical vestments, dyed with indigo and treated with milk that lasted over a century. Passed down from one parish priest to another, with only minor repair, stoles, chasubles, altar cloths, all touched by milk's quiet hand. And then there's the smell. This part often surprises us, but old villagers remembered it well. When cloth was freshly dyed and sun-dried, it carried a faint scent, milk, herbs, and earth. Not sour, not spoiled, just warm, alive, as if the garment itself had been fed, not just washed. A scent that faded in time, yes, but always came back faintly with warmth, with sunlight, with sweat. There's something tender about that. About wearing a garment not just made by hand, but seasoned with food. A blouse not just sewn, but nourished. A scarf made soft by the same milk that fed your child. And perhaps that's why villagers treated cloth with such reverence, not just because it was rare, or laborious, or expensive, but because it was alive with care. A thing made by many hands, milk-fed, sun-dried, and passed from mother to daughter, worker to widow, shepherd to bride. Tonight, as twilight settles over those old village paths, you can almost picture them. Garments fluttering on lines strung between crooked cottages, white linen, still damp with milk and mint, wool tunics dark with drying dye, stirred earlier with a wooden spoon by a girl no older than 12. Aprons fluttering like pennants, underthings whispering in the wind, and beneath them, perhaps a bowl, half filled with leftover milk water cool now, forgotten for a moment, but waiting to be reused, maybe to clean a comb, maybe to set another thread, maybe just to be poured at the roots of a tree, where milk would sink into earth and become, once more, something new. And next, we'll follow that very idea how milk, far from being wasted, found its way into the cleaning rituals of the medieval world. From stain removers to sacred purification rites, milk had 1,000 lives, and we've only just begun. We follow a thread of history that feels almost paradoxical. How, in a time with no soap as we know it, no detergents, and very little understanding of germs, milk was used to clean. Not just nourish or preserve, but to lift stains, polish surfaces, and even purify sacred spaces. In the modern world, the idea of using milk to clean might seem absurd. After all, it spoils, it sours, it leaves a smell. But in the Middle Ages, when every drop had a purpose and nothing could be wasted, even the sourest milk had its place. Especially in the heart of the home, the hearth and its circle of tools, garments, and worn wooden surfaces. Let's step into a medieval cottage just before dawn. The fire has burned down to ash and glowing coals. A mother wakes before the others, quietly. She wraps a shawl around her shoulders and walks to the hearth, where yesterday's curds sit in a clay bowl. The milk is no longer fresh, its surface is separated, thickened slightly, tinged with a faint scent of vinegar and wood smoke. And that's exactly what she wants, because today, she'll clean. One of the most common cleaning mixtures in the medieval kitchen was made from soured milk and ashes, yes, wood ashes from the hearth. Together, these ingredients formed a gentle, alkaline slurry. When rubbed onto wooden bowls, spoons, or trenchers, it lifted grease and removed the faint, sticky layer left by porridge or meat. She would dip a bit of rough cloth into the mixture, rub it along the grain of the wood, and then rinse with warm water. The casein from the milk helped bind residues. The ash acted like a mild abrasive. And the result? A polished, clean-feeling surface, free from stickiness and safer for the next meal. No need for soap. Just patience, repetition, and a bowl of what others might throw away. In wealthier homes or monastic kitchens, milk was even used to clean metal. Tarnished pewter or bronze utensils could be restored with a paste of thick milk and fine ground chalk, left to sit for a few minutes, then rubbed with a linen cloth. The paste pulled away dark stains and restored a soft shine. This wasn't a polish of vanity, it was practicality. Untreated metals could oxidize or react with acidic foods. Cleaning them with milk paste wasn't about sparkle, It was about safety and taste. A clean knife meant no bitter tang on your apple slice. A polished bowl didn't sour the broth before you served it. There's even evidence scattered in the notes of herbalists and domestic treatises that milk was used to clean leather. Not in great quantities, and not without risk, but for small items, pouches, belts, shoes, a rag dipped in milk and rubbed with beeswax created a subtle conditioner. It softened the leather, it darkened it slightly, it made it last. And once again, the secret was in the protein. Casein is a remarkable thing. In its simplest form, it binds. That's what makes it so useful in paints, glues, and yes, gentle cleaning pastes. But it also leaves behind a sheen, not oily, not sticky, just a soft protective gloss. In a world of rain, soot, and rough weather, this mattered more than we might think. There's another layer to this story too. A quieter one. In some villages, milk wasn't just used to clean the home, it was used to purify it. There are scattered folk traditions, especially in the Celtic regions and along the Germanic frontiers, that speak of milk as a cleansing agent for spaces believed to carry spiritual residue. A room where someone had died, a threshold crossed by someone sick, a cradle after an infant fever. In these spaces, women would sprinkle watered-down milk near the doorways, or dip birch branches into milk and sweep the air. Not quite superstition, not quite medicine. A ritual of care, repeated generation after generation. Milk, after all, was seen as pure, as nourishing, as a mother's gift. And so, even in its spoiled or sour form, it held a quiet sacredness. In Irish folk tales, milk is poured onto stones at Beltane to bless the land. In Baltic customs, new mothers bathed in milk water as a sign of renewal, and in some Eastern Orthodox Christian texts, milk is named alongside water and oil as a holy substance, capable not just of sustaining the body, but symbolically washing away hardship. Even on the skin, milk found a home. Women, especially those tending hearths or spending long hours spinning, rubbed their hands with cooled milk to soothe cracked knuckles. Not for beauty, but for comfort. The fat in milk softened calluses. The lactic acid, though unknown by name, gently exfoliated. Over time, hands grew less raw, less sore. And for children, especially those recovering from fevers or rashes, a bath with a little milk was sometimes recommended by wise women and midwives. Not every village had access to herbs or oils, but milk, that they often had. Even if just a ladle's worth from yesterday's pot. These were not indulgent rituals. There were no spa days in the Middle Ages. But milk offered small comforts, quiet gestures, a way to make the harshness of daily life feel just slightly softer. Tonight, as the cottage quiets and the fire burns low, the tools are back in their places. The bowls are clean, the floors swept with care, the air carries the faintest scent of milk and ash, warmed by flame and time. Outside, the stars blink into view over the thatched rooftops, and the village settles once more into its rhythm. In every home, behind every painted wall and woven curtain, milk has left its mark not just in nourishment, but in cleanliness, in quiet rituals, in the hush of early mornings and the contentment of earned rest. And in our next journey, we'll follow milk into the realm of healing, how it eased fevers, soothed burns, and even became a cornerstone of medicine in the world before antiseptic or anesthesia. Because in the Middle Ages, milk was more than sustenance, it was care. We continue tracing the soft, nurturing thread of milk through the heart of the medieval world, this time stepping gently into the quiet corners where pain lingered, wounds festered, and milk was offered not as food or paint, but as comfort, as medicine. In a time long before hospitals as we know them, before sterile gauze or antibiotics, healing was done by hand, by candlelight, in kitchens and corners and makeshift sick rooms tucked behind woolen curtains. And in these spaces where mothers tended sick children, monks cared for the dying, and wise women gathered herbs at dawn, milk had a role that was both humble and sacred. Let's begin in the most familiar setting. The cottage. A child has a fever. His cheeks are flushed. His limbs restless beneath a heavy woolen blanket. Outside, wind shakes the shutters. Inside, his mother sits beside the hearth, slowly heating a pot of milk mixed with honey and thyme. The scent fills the room, sweet and herbal. Comforting, she stirs carefully, not letting it boil, just warm enough to soothe. She lifts the cup to his lips, and he sips, slowly. Warm milk with herbs was a common remedy across much of Europe. Thyme for coughs, chamomile for sleep, sage for aching bellies. In regions where honey was scarce, a spoonful of butter stirred in provided fat, energy, and an extra coating for sore throats. Sometimes the milk itself was curdled on purpose, heated with vinegar or ale until thick, then strained and applied warm to sore joints or inflamed skin. These poultices, wrapped in linen and pressed to the body, were believed to draw out swelling, and in many cases they did provide relief. The warmth eased muscles, the fat soothed dry skin, the texture encouraged circulation. For burns, milk was often mixed with mashed bread or barley, spread over the wound, and tied in place. Not sterilized, of course, not in the modern sense, but clean enough by medieval standards. And cooling to the touch, a small mercy in a world of harsh remedies and limited hope. In wealthier homes, and especially in monasteries, milk played an even broader role. Monks were among the most learned healers of the medieval world. They copied ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, translated Arabic treatises, and kept herb gardens tucked inside cloister walls. And among the recipes and remedies recorded in their quiet script, milk appears again and again. In one manuscript from the 9th century, a monk named Ethelwald recommends a blend of warm milk and crushed poppy seeds to aid sleep and dull pain. In another, goat's milk is steeped with rue and mint for indigestion. A third describes milk wine, a curious potion of warm milk wine and cloves for treating melancholia, or what we might now call depression. And there's more. Cow's milk, when mixed with ash from burnt barley or grapevine, was used to clean ulcers. Sheep's milk, richer and thicker, was sometimes poured over open wounds to cleanse them, especially when mixed with honey. And donkey's milk, rare and prized, was considered nearly magical, softening the skin, calming inflammation, easing the sting of harsh treatments like cautery or lancing. It wasn't just the contents, it was the symbolism. Milk was seen as pure, life-giving, a gift of nature, of the body, of divine providence. So even when it failed to cure, it offered comfort. A bowl of warm milk brought to a sickbed was more than nutrition. It was a gesture, a message. You are loved, you are tended, you are not alone. And when death came, because it often did, milk played one last role. In some villages, it was tradition to wash the body of the deceased with milk and water. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to be remembered, especially for children, especially for mothers. A symbolic return to that first nourishment. A circle closed. Even midwives carried milk in their pouches, not just to feed, but to soothe. A few drops rubbed onto cracked lips. A cloth dipped in warm milk to clean a newborn's skin. The first baths were often a mixture of milk and rainwater, especially if the birth had been difficult. A soft introduction to the world. And for the mothers, their bodies were fragile after birth. Blood loss, fever, exhaustion. Midwives would bring bowls of warm milk mixed with beer or weak wine. Sometimes it was flavoured with fennel or anise, meant to strengthen, to soothe, to encourage the return of appetite. In regions where dairy was abundant, nursing mothers were encouraged to eat soft cheeses, drink warm milk with herbs, and rest in the quiet dark, their babies wrapped beside them. There's something quietly beautiful in this. A world so rough, so lacking in comfort by our standards, and yet, wherever care was given, milk was never far. And perhaps, most telling of all, was how milk crossed both the sacred and the ordinary. In some churches, particularly in rural areas, statues of the Virgin Mary were depicted nursing the Christ child. These images weren't just artistic, they were theological. They reminded the faithful that God, in becoming human, had once been nourished by milk, that holiness could be found in the most humble of substances. And in village homes, icons were sometimes anointed with a touch of milk before feast days, a way to bless, to cleanse, to remember. Because milk wasn't just for the body, it was for the spirit too. Tonight, as the candles burn low in the sick rooms of memory, and the stars hang quietly above old thatched roofs, we remember those acts of care. The warm cups, the poultices, the whispered prayers, the tiny, persistent belief that even the simplest things like milk could ease suffering. And in our next part, we'll step into the fields and byres where this milk began, where animals were tended with tenderness and tradition, where goats, cows, and sheep gave more than sustenance, they gave rhythm to the days and foundation to survival. Because in the medieval world, milk didn't just heal, it began with the animals who made everything possible. We're heading into the pastures and byres of medieval life to meet the true providers of this ancient lifeline. The animals whose milk painted walls, softened cloth, healed wounds, and filled bellies. Cows, goats, sheep, and in rare corners of the world, even donkeys. In a world without electricity, refrigeration, or industrial farms, milk came not from shelves, but from hoof and horn. And the bond between people and their animals wasn't one of detached utility, it was intimate. Daily, and often deeply emotional. Let's begin before sunrise. The sky is just beginning to pale over the low hills. In the stillness of the early morning, before the rooster has gathered his voice, a villager, often a woman, sometimes a child, rises quietly from a straw-stuffed mattress, pulls a rough wool shawl around her shoulders, and steps out into the chill. Her boots crunch lightly on frost, a breath clouds in the air, and she heads toward the byre, a small shed, sometimes attached to the house, sometimes just a short walk away. Inside, it's warmer, earthy. The smell of animals is strong but familiar, not offensive, just real, like hay, leather, and warm skin. The cow, if she's lucky enough to own one, shifts as she enters. Maybe lets out a soft low, maybe doesn't stir at all. But the routine is known, trusted. The woman settles beside her on a low stool, nestles a wooden pail under the udder, and begins to milk. It's not fast. It's not easy. It takes practiced hands, quiet patience, and often gentle words. A song, sometimes. Not for magic, just for calm. The rhythm of milking became part of the rhythm of medieval life. It wasn't just a chore, it set the pace. Before the bread was baked or the garden tended, the animals were cared for. First the cows, then the goats, then whatever chickens or sheep might be hiding eggs in the hay. And the milk that came from this ritual, it was precious. Not just as food, but as currency, medicine, even rent. In some regions, peasants owed their lords a measure of milk each week, or butter, or cheese. Fresh milk spoiled fast, so those with excess would churn or curdle it within hours. But even that first pail of the day, the warmest, richest one, was never wasted. In colder climates, goats were often preferred. Hardy, nimble, able to forage on rocky slopes or sparse meadows where cows might fail. Goat milk was easier to digest, less prone to spoiling, and often given to children or the elderly. It also required less space. A poor family might not afford a cow, but a goat? That was manageable. Goats were characters too. Mischievous, clever, stubborn. They found their way onto rooftops, into kitchens, over fences. But they gave milk faithfully, and in some households they were treated almost as family. In the highlands and dales, sheep were dual providers, wool and milk. Though sheep's milk was less common for drinking, it was highly prized for cheese. Richer, thicker, and full of fat, it made the kind of hard cheese that could last through winter. Stored in waxed cloth, tucked into cool corners of the pantry, these cheeses fed families long after fields had frozen and root cellars began to empty. Then there were donkeys, rare, often considered a luxury, but in monastic circles and noble estates, donkey's milk was kept for the sick, the newborn, and the infirm. It was the closest in composition to human milk, and thus seen as gentle, healing, and pure. Some midwives, when a new mother died in childbirth, would raise her child on donkey's milk, spoon-fed or dripped carefully onto linen. It was an act of quiet desperation and devotion. But back to the cows. In the Middle Ages, not all cows looked alike. Breeds were smaller, rangier, tougher than today's lumbering dairy giants. They produced less milk, often just a few litres per day. But what they gave was enough. Enough to cook with, to trade, to feed a child, and maybe set aside a little for the dye pot or the poultice. These cows were not machines. They had names, tempers, habits. They responded to the voices of those who tended them, and they were woven into the fabric of village life. When a cow calved, it was an event. Neighbours helped. Prayers were said. The health of the calf mattered, yes, but so did the milk. For after weeks or sometimes months without, the family's fortunes could change overnight. There are old folk sayings, etched into wood or tucked into proverbs, that praise the generosity of cows, that warn against taking them for granted, that liken their patience to saints and their milk to blessings. And when an animal grew old, in many villages, she was not discarded casually. Her final milkings were marked quietly, her name remembered. In some rare cases, when a beloved cow passed, a wisp of her tail hair might be braided and kept. A memento, a token of gratitude, because these animals weren't just food sources, they were part of a relationship, a rhythm, a trust. A rhythm echoed in festivals too. In springtime, when the cows were led out to pasture after winter's confinement, whole communities gathered. Children wove flowers into their hair. Cows were brushed, decorated with bells or garlands, and songs were sung, old, lilting tunes of welcome, of abundance, of hope for a good milking season. In alpine villages, the Almabtrieb, the autumn return of cows from mountain pastures, was a celebration. A farewell to the high meadows. A thanks to the animals. The best milkers wore elaborate headdresses of pine, ribbons, and carved wood. They were the stars of the procession. Even in death, the milkmakers were honoured. Bones saved for tools, hides tanned into leather, hooves made into glue. Nothing wasted, but always remembered. Tonight, as we leave the byres and pastures behind, we carry with us the gentle cadence of hooves on morning grass, the soft sound of milk hitting pail, the warmth of animal breath on cold fingers. And next, we'll step into the kitchen, where all this milk became more than sustenance, where it transformed into butter, cheese, curd, and delight, where the alchemy of dairy made the difference between hunger and plenty, between plain bread and a feast. Because in the medieval world, milk wasn't just harvested. It was crafted with patience, fire, and tradition. We're stepping into the flickering warmth of the medieval kitchen, a place of clattering pots, low fires, and the soft scent of bread and steam. And tonight, we follow milk through one of its most magical transformations. From liquid nourishment to solid gold, butter, cheese, curd. The quiet alchemy that turned milk into survival. In the medieval world, there was no such thing as just milk. Its life was fleeting. A few hours unrefrigerated, and it began to sour. But that didn't mean it was wasted. It meant it was changing, ripening, thickening, preparing for a new form. And so, through practiced tradition passed down by word and hand, villagers learned how to guide it, shape it, preserve it. Let's begin with butter. It started with cream. After the morning milking, the pail would rest near a cool hearth or in the cellar. Over hours, the cream would rise to the top, thick and pale, and it was carefully skimmed off with a wooden ladle. That cream was collected in a churn, sometimes a large upright barrel, sometimes a smaller, handheld jar with a paddle, and the labour began. Churning was not quick work. It could take half an hour, sometimes longer. The cream had to be at the right temperature, not too warm, not too cold. And then the paddle moved, steadily, rhythmically, until suddenly the texture changed, from cream to curdle to clump. The first sign of butter was subtle, tiny yellow flecks forming in the cloudy swirl. And then, as if by miracle, it separated. Golden clumps of butterfat and a thin liquid called buttermilk. The butter was gathered, rinsed with cold water, then kneaded to remove the remaining liquid. Salt was added not just for taste, but for preservation. In coastal villages, sea salt was prized for this. In the highlands, salt was sometimes bartered for, or even mined. Without it, butter spoiled quickly. But with it lasted. For days, sometimes weeks, in colder climates, longer. And the buttermilk? That, too. Used in baking, cooking, or even as a drink, especially during Lent, when meat and dairy were forbidden. But local customs occasionally bent the rules with watered buttermilk broths and porridges. Then there was cheese. Cheese was magic. It turned a short-lived substance into something sturdy, tradable. A wheel of hard cheese could feed a family for months. And in monasteries, where milk was abundant, cheese-making was both necessity and art. The process began with milk and rennet, a substance found in the stomach lining of calves, lambs, or kids. When added to milk, it caused it to clot, separating into curds and whey. The curds were cut, drained, sometimes cooked or pressed. The whey was fed to pigs or used in soups, and the cheese was aged in cellars, caves, or clay-lined pits turned regularly, rubbed with herbs or brine, and marked with symbols, dates, or initials. Some cheeses were soft, meant to be eaten fresh within days. Others, aged for months, developed rinds, flavours, textures that told the story of their maker. Cheeses with blue veins, born from moulds found in damp caves. Cheeses rubbed with ashes to protect from insects. Cheeses spiced with caraway, nettle, or garlic. In France, England, the Low Countries, each region had its own method, its own taste, and each home, if it had enough milk, had its own style. In leaner villages, simple curd cheese was common. Milk, left to sour naturally, was gently warmed and strained through linen. The resulting curd was pressed into moulds, wooden, clay, or even carved stone. These pressed cheeses were eaten quickly, crumbled over porridge, stirred into stews, but they mattered. In times of hunger, a single handful of curd could turn flatbread into a meal. And curds weren't just food. Some were pressed into cakes and left to dry in the sun, then grated later into soups like medieval bouillon cubes. Others were baked into tarts or pies, mixed with herbs or even dried fruit, a festive dish for feast days, a sign of abundance. And then, of course, there was whey. What remained after curds were taken was not wasted. Whey was fed to pigs, used in bread, or sipped warm with herbs. In some regions, whey baths were offered to the sick, believed to cleanse and strengthen the body. In Iceland and parts of Scandinavia, whey was even stored in barrels and drunk as a sour tonic. Known for its preservative powers, even when the milk had given all it could cream, curd, butter, whey, its work wasn't done. The remnants, the yellowed cloths, the crusted paddles, the dregs of curd were fed to chickens or stirred into compost. Everything returned to the land, nothing discarded, and perhaps most touching of all was the communal nature of it. In some villages, churns were shared. Cheese-making was done in groups. Women gathered, stirring and pressing together. Stories were told, songs hummed, children played in the corners. A wheel of cheese wasn't just food, it was a product of time, care, and community. And when butter was churned, especially during certain festivals, the first dollop was sometimes offered, placed on a stone, buried beneath a tree, or left on the windowsill overnight, not because it was wasted, but because it was thanked. Milk, in its final forms, became celebration. A pat of butter melting on fresh bread, a sliver of cheese passed around the hearth, a dollop of curd stirred into a newborn's first porridge. Each bite a reminder of the cow, the goat, the hands that milked, the hands that churned, the hands that served. And next, we'll follow those hands into the realm of beauty and adornment where milk, yes, milk, touched not just cloth and kitchens, but skin. Where it became lotion, balm, even perfume. A quiet elegance in an age of dirt and dust. Because in the medieval world, milk wasn't just practical. It was also sometimes quietly beautiful. We're wandering beyond the kitchens and cowsheds into a softer, more intimate space where the rough edges of medieval life gave way, if only for a moment, to gentleness. A place where milk was not for survival, but for comfort, for care, for the small, quiet desire to feel human. Tonight, we explore how medieval villagers and nobles alike used milk for beauty. It may seem strange at first. After all, when we picture the Middle Ages, we don't often think of skincare, of soft hands or fragrant baths. We imagine grime, toil, wind-chapped cheeks. And that's true much of the time. Life was rough, work was hard, skin cracked, fingernails were lined with earth. But even then, even in the thick of it, people yearned for softness, for radiance, for the comfort of touch. And that's where milk came in. Let's begin with the most basic ritual: washing. In villages, warm milk was occasionally used for cleansing the face, especially by women and children. Not daily, and not extravagantly, but as a treat. A basin of goat's milk, thinned with rainwater and gently warmed by the hearth, offered a kind of gentle exfoliation. The lactic acid in the milk, though unknown in name, helped lift grime. It softened dead skin. It left behind a faint glow. In herbal manuscripts and domestic guides, milk appears frequently in cosmetic recipes. A 14th century text from Flanders suggests a wash of new milk and rosewater to make the face fair. Another, from southern England, advises bathing the hands in milk with crushed strawberries to whiten the skin and sweeten the scent. This wasn't just vanity. Fair, soft skin was a sign of health, of care, of time not spent toiling endlessly in the Sunday. A luxury, yes, but also a shield. A way to present one's best self to the world. Even if the world was small and rough around the edges. In wealthier homes, beauty recipes grew more elaborate. Noble women had attendants who prepared lotions, balms, and pastes, many of which used milk as a base. One popular preparation was a milk and honey facial, left on the skin for a quarter hour, then gently wiped with a linen cloth soaked in lavender water. It left the skin glowing like the moon, as one poet wrote. Egg whites were sometimes added for tightening, crushed almonds for exfoliation. Milk was the base, the gentle carrier. It smoothed, it softened, it calmed. And then there were baths. Full-body milk baths were rare. Milk was too valuable to waste on such luxury. But on feast days, weddings, or times of mourning, a bride or widow might be bathed in milk water scented with herbs. Goat's milk or sheep's milk was most common, diluted with warm water and steeped with rosemary, chamomile, or crushed rose petals. This bath was more than cosmetic. It was symbolic, a way to mark transition, to bless the skin before a new chapter, to soothe a body that had been touched by grief or joy or birth. Even men, especially among the nobility, used milk. A knight returning from campaign might be offered warm milk to soak blistered feet. A monk, penitent and fasting, might rub his dry scalp with a mixture of milk and olive oil. In these acts, there was no extravagance, just care. There's a gentleness to this we often overlook. In an age of hardship, these small rituals mattered. A bowl of milk to soften calloused hands, a cloth dipped in milk to calm sunburn, a drop of milk stirred into perfumed oil to stretch it further just enough to scent a ribbon, a kerchief, a lover's token. And speaking of perfume, in some regions, especially in southern Europe, milk was used to carry fragrance. Perfumed milk was a luxury of the wealthy. A blend of milk, musk, and floral distillates kept in covered jars. When dabbed onto skin or poured lightly onto cloth, it left a subtle, lingering scent. Nothing overpowering, just a whisper, a trace, and though rare, these scented milks found their way into poetry and song. In Provençal verse, a lover writes of his beloved smelling of almond milk and crushed violets. In Norse sagas, milk is praised as the balm of Freya, a gift to women, soothing and strong. Even in religious art, beauty and milk intertwine. The Virgin Mary is often depicted with luminous skin, symbolic of purity and divine care. In some depictions, she's shown offering milk both sacred and tender, and in the minds of the faithful, this linked milk not just with nourishment, but with grace, with the care of the soul as well as the body. Tonight, as the fire crackles low and the village settles into sleep, imagine a woman at her basin. She dips her cloth into a small bowl of milk and rose water. She presses it gently to her cheeks, her forehead, her neck. The room is quiet. Her children are asleep. This moment is hers. Outside, the world may be harsh. But here, in this soft ritual, she reclaims a bit of herself. A memory of girlhood, a promise of tomorrow, a kindness. Because in the Middle Ages, milk wasn't just for nourishment. It was for the soul, for touch, for beauty. And next, we'll follow milk into its strangest form yet paint. Not just for houses or cloth, but for sacred murals, illuminated manuscripts, and even hidden spells. A brushstroke of milk could preserve a story for 1,000 years. Because in the medieval world, milk didn't just soften skin, it captured eternity. We follow milk through yet another doorway, this time into the still, candlelit world of medieval art. A world of pigments ground by hand, of murals fading into plaster, of delicate pages that glowed like windows to heaven. Because tonight, we discover that milk was not only sustenance, not only ritual, but paint. And in the quiet corners of abbeys and homes, it became a way to preserve beauty, to write stories in colour, and to mark walls with memory. Let's begin in a monastery. Picture a scriptorium dimly lit, hushed, its air thick with beeswax and incense. A monk sits hunched over a sheet of vellum, the pale curve of calfskin stretched tight before him. He's already copied the black ink, the careful Latin script shaped from soot, iron, and milk. But now comes the illumination. He reaches for a small shell dish, inside of which is a creamy white liquid. Not water, not wine, but a mixture of milk and pigment, ground malachite for green, lapis lazuli for blue, cinnabar for red. Each one suspended in casein, a protein found in milk that binds colour to surface with surprising strength. This was casein paint, and it changed everything. Unlike egg tempera, which dried brittle and fast, or oil, which was still being explored in secret corners of Europe, casein paint struck a balance. It was flexible, durable, smooth to apply, and when dried, it held colour with a kind of earthy richness, matte but deep, like stone warmed by sunlight. It didn't flake the way chalk did. It didn't shine the way oils would. It simply stayed, century after century, in frescoes and wall paintings, especially in churches and rural chapels. Casein was used as a binder between pigment and plaster. Artists mixed milk curds with lime or ammonia, creating a base that could be brushed directly onto walls. The result? Murals that glowed faintly in candlelight. that whispered their stories to those who came seeking comfort or instruction. Saints with golden halos, angels in blue robes, fields of lilies and flocks of sheep all coloured with milk-touched paint. Some of these images survive even now, tucked behind altar stones or preserved under centuries of plaster. When uncovered, the colours are often still vivid, not glossy, but alive, as if the milk never left. And it wasn't only for grand spaces. In village homes, milk paint was used to decorate the interior walls, not in extravagant scenes, but in bands of colour, stenciled flowers, or symbolic shapes, circles for protection, wheat for blessing, stars for divine guidance. Women often mixed the paints themselves, combining soured milk with lime, ochre, charcoal, or crushed brick. A wall washed with milk paint had a unique texture, velvety, breathable, with a faint scent of the earth. It didn't peel, it didn't trap dampness. It faded slowly, gracefully, like memory, and it was affordable. Any cottage with a goat, a cow, or access to whey could make it. Even children were painted with milk. Not literally, but through toys, cradles, and wooden charms coated in casein-based pigment. The paint was safe, non-toxic, long-lasting. A child's rattle decorated with dots of blue, a spinning top painted red, a cradle carved by a father's hands. These objects weren't just practical, they were protective. In some regions, colour itself was believed to ward off illness or evil. Red for strength, blue for calm, yellow for joy, and milk, by carrying the colour, became part of the blessing. And there's something else, something more secretive. In a few curious texts, hidden among recipes and herbals, are mentions of milk ink used in invisible writing. Letters written with milk, dried, colourless, almost imperceptible. Only when heated by flame, by breath, by sunlight would the words appear. This technique, though not widely used, found a home in monasteries and courts. For private notes, for love letters perhaps, or messages passed between hands during times of unrest. It's a simple idea, but a profound one. Milk so humble, so basic became the medium for secrecy, for intimacy, for trust, and in the hands of those who painted, whether monks or mothers, it became something more still. It became memory, because every brushstroke was deliberate, time-consuming, layered, and in a world without mass production, to paint was to preserve, to say, this matters, this colour, this saint, this moment, this child, and milk made it possible. Tonight, as we imagine the fading light of a monastery chapel or the soft hum of a village evening, we see the walls, coloured softly, faded but still there, a line of blue along a lintel, a swirl of red above a door, a cluster of leaves, painted in green so many years ago by someone whose name we will never know, and we think of the hand that held the brush. The breath held still, the bowl of milk and earth stirred carefully, not spilled, because in the Middle Ages, milk wasn't just for nourishment. It was for art, for light, for legacy. And in our next journey, we'll follow that legacy into the realm of ritual where milk became offering, sacrifice, and symbol, where it crossed into the sacred, because milk, in the medieval mind, wasn't just matter, it was meaning. We continue our soft, candlelit walk through the role of milk in medieval life, this time into a space even quieter than the scriptorium or the hearth. A space of whispered prayers and ritual gestures. A space where milk crossed the threshold between the earthly and the sacred. Between nourishment and offering. Because in the medieval world, milk wasn't just food. It was symbol. Across villages, valleys, chapels and cloisters, milk appeared in rites of passage, folk magic, and religious practices. It was poured, scattered, blessed, and even feared. And behind every act, whether sanctioned by the church or whispered behind garden hedges, was the same instinct: to connect with something larger than the self. Let's begin with birth. We've touched before on how milk soothed the sick, fed the young, and comforted the grieving. But in medieval birth rituals deeply sacred, deeply human milk played a quiet but essential part. A bowl of warm milk, sometimes with honey, was often the first thing offered to a woman after labour. Not bread, not wine. Milk. It restored strength, yes, but it also marked transition. The new mother was no longer just herself. She was now giver of milk, nourisher of life. Midwives, especially those trained in herbal lore, sometimes bathed newborns in milk and water. Goat's milk for softness, sheep's milk for warmth. The bath cleansed more than the body. It welcomed the soul. It whispered, "You belong here." Some regions even practiced a curious custom, spilling a few drops of milk at the threshold after a birth. It was a blessing and a warning, to ward off spirits, to ask the land's favour, to say, "This child is claimed, this home is watched." And then there was the church. Officially, milk was not a sacrament. But unofficially, it soaked the edges of sacred ritual in quiet ways. Take the Feast of the Assumption. In parts of France and Italy, villagers offered milk and honey at small roadside shrines to the Virgin Mary, not as doctrine, but as devotion. The milk symbolized purity, nourishment. The Mother of Christ, after all, had nursed the divine. What more holy gesture than to mirror that gift? In monasteries, especially among the Cistercians and Benedictines, milk had its place in daily rhythms. It broke the long fasts. It comforted the ill. And in the writing of mystics, milk often stood for divine love, simple, sustaining, unearned. One nun, in a letter preserved from the 13th century, writes, "As milk flows from the mother without command, so does God's mercy flow to us, and still deeper than doctrine beneath it." Around it were the folk traditions. Folk rites often involved milk as offering to forces older than the church. Spirits of field and wood, ancestors, shadows. In the Scottish Highlands, crofters poured milk at the base of trees known as fairy trees, especially hawthorn or elder. It was a gesture of respect, of fear, to keep the good people from causing mischief, to bless the cows, to keep the milk flowing. In the Balkans, it was said that if a neighbour's envy soured your milk, you could reverse the curse by pouring warm milk in a circle and placing a red-hot iron in the centre. The milk would hiss and bubble, and the spell would break. In Brittany, France, villagers left bowls of milk outside their homes on certain nights, especially around All Saints or the summer solstice, to feed the wandering dead, to say, "You are remembered." And in Germany, a curious superstition lingered for centuries, that if you spilled milk, it should never be wiped up in haste. Let it dry, let it soak in, for milk, once spilled, might carry your fortune with it. Better to lose a rag than a blessing. Some of these practices were frowned upon by priests, others were tolerated, and a few were quietly absorbed into church life. Because in truth, milk blurred the lines. It belonged to both the sacred and the ordinary, to prayer and porridge, to cradle and cross. There were even miracle stories involving milk. In one Italian village, a statue of the Virgin was said to weep milk when a plague threatened. In another, a spring of milky water appeared where a martyr's bones were buried. Pilgrims came with cups. With faith, they drank, they bathed, they believed. Even the shape of devotion mirrored milk. The rounded vessels of offering, the cupped hands, the gentle flow, and the warmth. Always the warmth. Tonight, as the stars peer down over quiet chapels and worn village stones, imagine those ancient gestures. A woman pouring milk at a doorstep, whispering a prayer. A monk offering a bowl to a sick brother. A child dipping their fingers into a bowl of milk and tracing a cross on the wall before sleep. These were not grand rituals, not always even spoken of, but they lingered, Because in the Middle Ages, milk was more than nutrition. It was memory. It was hope. It was the bridge between flesh and spirit. And in our next part, we'll step into the shadows of fear, because where milk offered blessing, it could also spark suspicion. Accusations of theft, of witchcraft, of power taken, not earned, because in the medieval world, milk was life, and anything that stole life was feared. We follow milk into its most unsettling form, not as nourishment, comfort, or even blessing, but as something coveted, feared, and sometimes accused of being stolen. Because in the medieval imagination, milk wasn't simply a gift from nature. It was something that could be taken by envy, by spell, by unseen hand. And in a world where milk meant life, this made it powerful. And power, in the wrong hands, became fear. We begin in a quiet village. A cow has gone dry. Yesterday she gave nearly a pailful of milk. Today, barely a trickle. Her calf nuzzles for more, but nothing comes. The farmer frowns. His wife whispers. And someone mentions the old woman who passed by yesterday, muttering to herself, eyes sharp as frost. She looked at the cow. Someone says, "That's all it takes. Milk theft by magic." What some called charming the milk was a common accusation across medieval Europe. And it wasn't a metaphor. It was taken literally. People believed that milk could be drawn from cows or from people by supernatural means, through spells, through touch, even through tools like enchanted ropes, bags, or wooden staves. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, stories spoke of women who could steal milk by milking a rope. Yes, a length of cord laid across the threshold of another's barn and tugged gently while chanting a rhyme. The milk, it was said, would flow from the neighbour's cow into your own churn. In Scotland, milk was sometimes stolen by witches' hares, creatures that were not hares at all, but shape-shifted women, and fleecets, two flee, end fall. They would sneak into pastures before dawn, suckle the cows unseen, then vanish into the heather, and the cows would stand dull and empty, their udders slack. In Slavic lands, stories tell of milk witches who could draw milk from the very air. They needed only a pot, a whisper, and envy in the heart. A jealous glance was enough to sour the cream, to thin the curd, to ruin the yield. And so, defences were born. Iron nails hammered into barn doors, rowan branches hung above stalls, stones shaped like eyes placed near the milking pail to reflect the evil gaze. Some farmers tied bells to their cows, chiming not for beauty, but to drive off spirits. And others turned to the church. A priest might bless the barn, sprinkle holy water, mark the animal with a cross in ashes, or he might recommend something older, less official, a charm sewn into the cow's halter, a prayer muttered while churning, because the line between faith and fear was thin, and the truth was people were scared. Milk was fragile, one day plentiful, the next day gone, and without it, life grew hard. No butter to trade, no curds for supper, no whey for the piglets. In a time when survival was precarious, even a single spoiled batch could stir suspicion, and suspicion often fell on those who lived on the edges. The elderly, the poor, the silent, the women who gathered herbs at dawn or tended bees, the ones who lived alone, who knew old rhymes. They were called wise women sometimes, midwives, curers. But when things went wrong, when cows went dry, when milk turned blue, when a child sickened after feeding it, didn't take much for the whispers to turn. She knows too much. I saw her staring. I heard her speaking. Not Latin, something else. There are records cold, faded, terrible of women, accused of milk theft, through witchcraft, tried, shamed, some punished, some banished, a few executed. In a Swiss village in the 15th century, a woman confessed under pressure that she had stolen milk using a carved wooden cow, whispered to every night. She said the milk flowed into her kitchen. The villagers had found her churn full, her neighbours' pails empty. In Iceland, a tale survives of a woman who fashioned a creature called a tilbury, a milk-sucking familiar, made from human bone and wool. It would steal cream from cows and bring it to her, dripping from its mouth. Folk horror, yes, but also fear, of hunger, of envy, of isolation. Not every story ended in harm. Some turned into cautionary tales. Don't borrow milk from someone who never owns a cow. Don't give your first churning away, it must stay in the house, or the luck will leave with it. Always throw the first drop of milk on the earth, for the spirits. And some were quiet acts of resistance. Women accused of charms sometimes confessed with a wink, as if to say, if I can call milk from stone, perhaps you should treat me kindly. Others survived by turning their skill into service, making curd for the sick, butter for the altar, using their knowledge not to harm, but to heal. Though the fear lingered, milk's power ran both ways. It could feed, it could rot, it could paint saints, it could draw suspicion, and perhaps that's what made it so human. It was not perfect, not divine, it was real, vulnerable, alive. And the people of the Middle Ages knew this, felt it in their bones, in their hunger, in their hope. Tonight, as the wind rustles through the thatch and the fields lie quiet, we remember the unseen fears of long ago. The cow that gave less than expected, the churn that wouldn't set, the look across the fence, and the way a warm white liquid could mean survival or accusation, because in the medieval world, milk was more than a substance. It was power. And next, we'll return to warmth, to the table, to the shared joy of milk-made meals, custards, porridges, feasts, made from what was gathered, curdled, and cooked with love. Because if milk was sometimes feared, it was far more often cherished. We're returning to warmth, to the steady hush of the hearth and the quiet clatter of wooden spoons. After shadowing the fears and folk magic tied to milk, we now gather around the table. Because in the medieval world, milk wasn't only mystery, it was mealtime. It filled pots, thickened stews, lightened breads, and sweetened the rarest of feasts. Tonight, we're stepping into the kitchen, and not the grand, echoing halls of noble manors, though those had their butter-rich delicacies too. No, we're heading into village kitchens, monastic kitchens, humble, low-ceilinged spaces, where meals were made not with extravagance, but with care, with season, skill, and the quiet joy of turning very little into something warm and filling. Let's start with the morning. In many peasant homes, the first meal of the day was simple. Milk, porridge, barley, or oats, soaked overnight, simmered in milk until soft and steaming. If honey or berries were on hand, they'd be stirred in. If not, a pinch of salt and perhaps a scrape of hard cheese. Children often had the thickest portion cooled, scooped into clay bowls, eaten with fingers if spoons were scarce. Adults, especially those heading to the fields, might eat theirs with black bread or a bit of butter if the churn had been kind that week. In monasteries, the first bell for prayer rang before dawn, and breakfast followed prime, often a bowl of warm milk and spelt, or a soft cheese with rye bread. No meat, rarely eggs, but the milk made it rich, comforting, holy even. Midday meals were heartier. When milk was abundant, it was used to enrich stews, especially those made with legumes, roots, or cabbage. A splash of milk transformed a simple pot of boiled peas into something creamy. If cream could be spared, even better. In winter, milk-based soups with leeks or onions provided warmth from the inside out. In homes with cows or goats, curds were a frequent addition. Left over from cheese-making, curds were mild, nutritious, and endlessly versatile. They were mixed into doughs, fried in small cakes, or crumbled over greens. And then there were the pies. No, not flaky, buttery modern pies, but early medieval cheesecakes of a sort. In regions like England and the Low Countries, curd cheese was mixed with egg, a little flour, and sometimes dried fruit or sugar, if it could be afforded. Baked in open hearths, these became tarts served warm, especially on feast days. For Lent and other fasts, when meat and rich dairy were forbidden, milk alternatives were made from almonds. Almond milk was more common than we often imagine, especially in monasteries and among the wealthier classes. It was made by grinding almonds to a paste, mixing them with warm water, and straining the result. The liquid resembled milk in colour and was used in everything from stews to desserts. Still, real milk returned eagerly after the fasts, and no time more so than Easter. After the long abstinence of Lent, the return of butter, cheese, and cream was cause for celebration. Villagers would churn butter, dyed with marigold petals to give it a golden hue. Sweet custards were baked in shared ovens, the soft scent of eggs and milk and spice drifting through narrow lanes. One beloved dish across much of medieval Europe was flan. Not quite like today's version, but similar, a mixture of milk, eggs, and honey or sugar, baked until set. Served cool, often decorated with herbs or flowers. In some monasteries, it was eaten on specific feast days with solemn joy. And speaking of custards, milk custards, called crèmes or blamingers, were reserved for the sick, the elderly, or honoured guests. They were made by slowly heating milk with rice or ground almonds, thickened with egg or starch, and gently spiced with cinnamon or mace. For nobles, saffron turned them gold. For common folk, honey and a sprig of mint. What mattered most was texture: smooth, soft, soothing. A dish not just of flavour, but of comfort, of care. Then there were drinks. Warm milk sweetened with honey was a common nightcap. So was milk posset, a hot drink made from milk curdled with ale or wine, often spiced, and sipped before bed. In inns and way stations, travellers might share a communal pot, ladling their portion into wooden cups. In the colder north, warm milk was sometimes steeped with herbs, like thyme or sage, served to those suffering from coughs, or simply to warm hands after a frost-covered walk. Milk wasn't only present in the body, it was a presence in the home. The bubbling pot, the rising cream, the slow stir of a wooden spoon. These were not merely tasks, they were rituals, moments of stillness in a world of labour. And milk had its celebrations too. In parts of Wales and Brittany, the first milking of spring was honoured with small cakes and a bowl of cream shared among family. In alpine villages, cheese festivals marked the return of the herds, with tables laid out beneath carved wooden beams, cheese wheels sliced with reverence, butter served in flower shapes. In noble courts, subtleties, those elaborate, edible centerpieces, were sometimes made from sugar and milk, moulded into castles, birds, or scenes from myth. Guests marvelled, but even in such excess, the base was humble. Milk. Tonight, as we picture the glow of an evening hearth, the smell of warming bread, the slow clink of ladle against pot, we remember the role milk played not just as ingredient, but as rhythm. From the baby's first porridge to the monk's flan, from the worker's stew to the noble's tart, milk flowed through every table, every season, every hunger. And next, we'll step outside again to the land itself, to the soil, the grass, the wildflowers that fed the animals, and, through them, the people. Because without the pasture, there was no milk, and the bond between land, beast, and bowl was deeper than we might guess. Because in the medieval world, milk wasn't just cooked, it was grown. We take a quiet walk beneath the low clouds and among the green, out beyond the thatched roofs and open gates, out into the meadows, the hills, and the heaths. Because to understand medieval milk, you must understand where it began, not just in the udder, but in the grass. Tonight, we explore the sacred pact between land and milk. To many villagers, the pasture was more than grazing ground. It was a living pantry, a soft, breathing partner in survival. Without its grasses, herbs, and wild blooms, cows would weaken, goats would dry, and milk would vanish. And so, fields were watched, tended, fenced, prayed over. In early spring, when the frost melted and the first shoots appeared, villagers gathered with cautious joy. The grass was not just green, it was hope. Families with milk animals eagerly counted the days until they could lead their beasts out of the winter byres and onto open pasture. Cows and goats leapt with joy, tails raised, bells clanging, as if they too knew what the grass meant. And not all pastures were alike. In the flatlands of England, cows grazed among damp meadows, rich in clover and buttercup. These soft plants, high in protein and moisture, gave milk that was sweet and abundant. In the rocky folds of the Alps, goats and sheep nibbled on hardy herbs thyme, sage, yarrow, which gave the milk a distinct aroma and taste, prized for cheese. The term terroir, which we now use for wine, held true for milk long before it had a name. A cheese made from cows feeding on dandelion and clover tasted different from one made from milk, produced in a salt-sprayed coastal field. The land was in the milk, quietly, always. Farmers knew this, they planned for it. Certain grasses were sown, if seed could be spared. Nettles and docks were managed, neither fully cut down nor allowed to overgrow. Pastures were rotated, left to rest, fenced from pigs and sheep when needed, and in some areas, meadow rights were a source of both pride and tension. Villages often shared common grazing lands, spaces where cows from different households could feed together. These lands were governed by ancient rules: how many animals each family could send, when grazing could begin, who mowed the grass for hay. Disputes were common, but so was cooperation, because the health of the pasture meant the health of the people. When drought came, milk dried up. When floods ruined the meadows, butter disappeared from tables. In years of plenty, milk was shared. Butter churned for feast days. Cheese aged for leaner months. But always, always it began with the land. Some pastures were named and blessed. A field called Buttermead might be mentioned in church records. Cow Hollow, Milk Rise, names that told the story of what the land gave. And when a cow became ill, it wasn't just the animal that was tended, it was the pasture that was questioned. Had a bad plant grown in? Had someone trespassed? Had the land been angered? Yes, angered, because in the medieval imagination, the land had moods. It could bless, and it could withdraw. To soothe it, milk was sometimes offered not in greed, but in gratitude. A few drops spilled before the first milking of spring. A bowl left near a boundary stone. A cup poured on a distant stump. These were not official rites, not always spoken of, but they were practiced, because villagers knew, without needing to say it, that the pasture watched them too. And when summer waned and grasses browned, the rhythm shifted. Cows came home from the high meadows. Goats returned to lower slopes. Pastures were allowed to go fallow. The last cutting of hay was stored, and every family tallied what the land had yielded. Was there enough hay to last the winter? Enough dried herbs for the goats? Enough cheese in the cellar to see them through? And then came the frost. Milk grew scarcer, but its memory lingered in butter, wrapped in cloth, in wheels of cheese rubbed with brine, in pots of curd buried in cool earth. And when the land slept, the people waited, watched the sky, listened for thaw, dreamed of green. Some prayed, others simply trusted, because in the end, milk was not just a product of cows or goats. It was a product of partnership, with the land, with the seasons, with the quiet pact that said, "If you tend me, I will feed you." And the people believed it. Tonight, as the winds stir softly across empty fields, we remember the quiet power of the grass beneath the milk, the unseen green that fed the beasts, that filled the pails, that warmed the pots. Because in the medieval world, milk was not just poured, it was grown. And next, we'll step into the cold shadows of winter to see how milk was preserved, how warmth was shared, and how even in the harshest months, the bond between land, animal, and home endured. Because milk didn't end with the frost. It waited. We're walking through frost, through the long hush of medieval winter, when snow blanketed the pastures, and even the trees seemed to sleep. Tonight, we explore how milk so fleeting, so warm, so perishable managed to endure in the coldest months. How it was preserved, protected, and cherished. Because in the medieval world, winter was not a season. It was a test. Milk, at first glance, seems the least likely survivor. It spoils quickly. Cows give less in the cold. Goats, sensitive to frost, may dry out entirely until spring. And yet, milk's presence in winter, though quiet, was essential. It appeared in broths, in hard cheese, in memories. A spoonful of butter on root porridge. A wedge of old curd, firm as wood but sharp with taste. So how did they do it? Let's begin with preservation. Cheesemaking, as we've seen, was the primary method. During the lush days of late spring and summer, milk was churned into butter, but more importantly, pressed into wheels of cheese. These were aged in cellars, caves, or even deep pits lined with straw and clay. Some cheeses were rubbed with salt water. Others were coated in beeswax. A few were buried entirely hidden from rodents, shielded from damp, allowed to rest. By winter, these wheels were gold. They were cracked open slowly, shared carefully. A feast day might see an entire wheel cut for guests. Ordinary days allowed only a sliver. But the milk of summer lived on, in solid form. Butter, too, was kept, salted heavily, packed into crocks, covered in linen, soaked with vinegar or brine. In colder regions, the butter was simply frozen, wrapped in hide or cloth, and buried in snow, dug up when needed, warmed by the hearth, spread on hard bread. In some places, a special winter butter was made, churned with dried herbs or roots, giving it a spice taste and helping it last longer. It was not as rich as summer butter, but it held the memory of Sunday. And then there was curd. Fresh cheese, if dried properly, could keep for weeks. Hung in cloth, placed near the chimney, turned and scraped to prevent mould. These dense, chewy curds were crumbled into stews, softened in broth, or mixed with root mash. Whey, the byproduct of curd, was sometimes fermented slightly and stored as a drink or soup base. It was sour, but nourishing. In hard times, it filled the belly. Monasteries, more resourceful than most, kept precise records of how much milk was turned to cheese, how long it aged, when it could be served. For them, milk was not just food, it was part of divine rhythm. A wheel of cheese from August might be opened on the feast of St. Bridget in February, a saint deeply associated with milk and dairy, and the people remembered her. Brigid, in Irish lore, was said to have fed the poor with endless milk, her churn never empty. She was called the Milkmaid of God. Her feast in early February marked the hope of spring, the first stirring of lambs, the earliest grass. And so, in the darkest weeks, milk returned, slowly, quietly. But what about homes with no cellar, no herd, no abundance? These families turned to sharing. It was common in villages for a household with milk-producing animals to offer small amounts to neighbours during the leanest months. A cup of whey, a spoon of butter, a bowl of buttermilk soup. Not out of luxury but necessity. Today they gave. Tomorrow they might receive. In some regions, milk was mixed with ground grains and baked into hard cakes that kept for months. These were soaked in broth or milk when available, softening into porridge. Children were taught to chew them slowly. Elders, with worn teeth, softened them with wine or ale. And in the rare moments of celebration, Yule, Epiphany, Candlemas milk reappeared in symbolic form. A warm custard, a flan, a single tart shared between many. Some were spiced with cloves, a rare luxury. Others used only what could be spared. A bit of honey, a sprinkle of nutmeg. But always, always, milk meant comfort, even if it came in crumb or crust, even if it was only remembered. And then there was the churn itself. In many homes, the churn stood unused during winter, cleaned, covered, placed near the hearth. But some families left a bit of cream to sour in a small pot, just in case. If warmth returned suddenly, if the cow gave more than expected, they might try a small batch. Churning in winter was harder. The cream thickened slowly. Cold slowed the separation. But when butter finally formed, it was treasured. Spread thinly, melted over lentils, offered to the church in thanks. There's a kind of quiet bravery in this, in keeping hope through hunger, in storing not just cheese, but trust, in believing that green would return, that cows would calf, that the pasture would soften, that the milk would flow again. Tonight, as we sit beside our own modern comforts, it's worth imagining the medieval hearth, not for its hardship, but for its resilience. The flicker of flame, the smell of dry wood and iron pot, a wedge of hard cheese sliced slowly, a mother stirring curds into soup, a father checking the pail before dawn, just in case. And next, we'll return to the idea that sparked it all, the painting of homes with milk. Now that we've walked through the heart of medieval milk, we'll explore how villagers used it, not just in kitchens and cradles, but on walls. How it became colour, protection, and charm. Because in the medieval world, milk wasn't only consumed, it sheltered. We step up to the walls, those timber frames and daubed panels, those thatched cottages and sunlit barns. We finally arrive at the question that began this whole journey. Why did medieval villagers paint their houses with milk? The answer, as you now know, is not simple, because milk in the medieval world was more than food. It was medicine, comfort, symbol, and sacrifice. But why? Why take something so precious, so perishable, and spread it across the outside of your home? Let's begin with the material. When villagers painted their houses with milk, they weren't using fresh, drinkable milk. That would have been wasteful. Instead, they used soured milk, clabbered, curdled, or otherwise unsuitable for consumption. The liquid left behind was rich in casein, a protein that, when combined with lime or clay, formed a surprisingly strong and durable paint. Casein paint, as we now call it, was breathable, flexible, and most importantly, resistant to weather, pests, and mould. It adhered well to rough surfaces like plaster, wood, and stone. It could be made easily, at home, with ingredients found in most medieval kitchens. The basic recipe? Soured milk, lime often from crushed shells or limestone, water and pigment, mixed into a smooth liquid and brushed onto the walls with handmade brooms or rags. And when it dried, it formed a soft, chalky layer, white or tinted, depending on the pigment. It wasn't shiny, it wasn't grand, but it protected. It kept the wind out, the moisture at bay, the bugs away. It slowed the crumbling of wattle and daub. It masked the blemishes of age. And more than that, it glowed. In the early morning light, milk-painted cottages shimmered faintly. Not with opulence, but with softness, a sense of care, of dignity. Most common was white, a pure, clean hue that brightened even the smallest home. But villagers also tinted the paint with earth pigments. Ochre for yellow, soot for grey, clay for red, powdered herbs for green. Colour mattered. A yellow border might signal protection. A red door could ward off misfortune. Whitewash, especially when applied near windows or thresholds, was thought to repel evil. A milk-painted home wasn't just weatherproof, it was blessed. And then there were the patterns. In some regions, especially in the Alps and Nordic lands, villagers painted designs along the eaves and doors. Spirals, stars, flower motifs, geometric shapes. Some were purely decorative, others carried meaning. A circle for unity, a tree for growth, a wave for good harvests. Children learned these symbols alongside prayers. And every spring, when the mud dried, the cows freshened, and milk became plentiful again, villagers refreshed their homes. A new coat of paint, a new charm against misfortune, a fresh beginning. It was a ritual as much as a chore. In many places, entire families took part. Children stirred the mixture. Elders chose the pigments. Women painted windowsills. Men did the upper walls. And once finished, a small token and herb bundle, a carved stone, a pressed flower might be tucked into the foundation or lintel. For luck, for blessing. It's easy to forget that for medieval people, the home was more than shelter. It was life. And milk, brushed onto the outside, was a way of saying, this place is alive, this place is cared for. Even in towns and cities, milk-based paint had its place. Guild halls and workshops were often whitewashed, both inside and out, not only for cleanliness, but for clarity. A sign of honesty, a sign that this business, this butcher, this baker, this tanner took pride in its walls. In monasteries, cells and corridors were coated in milk paint, tinted with soft minerals, pale blue for peace, muted green for reflection. The walls, so plain, were yet so loved. Scrubbed clean, painted anew when they faded. And across Europe, chapels and shrines, especially in remote villages, used milk paint to keep sacred spaces bright and clean. Even today, some of these buildings survive beneath layers of time, still faintly dusted with the touch of milk and lime. There's something humbling in that. The same milk that fed a child or softened a hand also preserved a wall, a prayer, a story. And though no one remembers the names of the painters, their brushstrokes remain. In one corner of a Norwegian barn, a white spiral can still be seen, nearly 600 years old. In a Welsh cottage, pale yellow vines snake along a beam-split wall. In a Bavarian chapel, the milk-white ceiling has never flaked, all done with the simplest of tools, all made with what was left after the butter was churned, the cheese drained, the cream skimmed, nothing wasted, everything used. Tonight, as we rest beneath our own ceilings, modern, safe, far from frost, we remember those hands, stirring the bucket, dipping the cloth, spreading the mixture, watching it dry. We remember that even the humblest substance can become shelter. That care lives in the quiet things. And next, we'll travel into the sounds of the village bells, bleating, the clink of pails. We'll listen to how milk shaped daily rhythms, how its sound and silence marked time, and how even its absence was felt. Because in the medieval world, milk wasn't only seen or tasted, it was heard. We tilt our ears toward the quiet music of the past. Because in a world before clocks, alarms, and phone reminders, people told time by what they heard. And milk, yes, even milk had a sound, a rhythm, a daily melody of clinks and bleats, of buckets and breath. Tonight, we're listening to the world the milk made. Let's begin just before dawn. A cow lowing softly in the byre, a wooden gate creaking, the hush of footsteps over straw. Then, the gentle rhythm of milking the pull and release. The stream of milk hitting the pail in a warm, steady beat. The clink of tin, the rustle of hay, the slow breath of the animal, warm in the cold air. For many families, this was the first sound of the day. No roosters, no bells, just milk, and the milkmaid's song. Yes, songs. Milking was often accompanied by quiet tunes, especially in regions where folk tradition was strong. In the Scottish Highlands, women sang walking songs while milking, not only to pass time, but to soothe the cow. In parts of Scandinavia, there were culling calls high, echoing tones that carried over valleys to bring cows home or calm them before milking. The melody mattered. It was said that cows gave better milk when the milker was gentle, calm, and singing. A harsh word could sour the yield. A kind voice kept it flowing. And this wasn't superstition, it was relationship. Cows knew their milkers, recognized voices, trusted hands. The bond was as real as any human friendship, built on touch, repetition, and tone. And so, each morning began with sound. Soft, steady, sacred. Then came the clatter of pails being carried to the house, the hiss of cream being heated, the splash of milk into bowls, the tap of spoon against rim, and then silence. The moment the milk was poured, the world seemed to pause. Children sipping porridge, elders blowing on their broth. A moment of warmth before the work began. In monasteries, bells marked the hours, but between them, milk guided the rhythm. The infirmary's soft steps as a novice brought warm milk to a sick brother, the quiet gurgle of a custard being stirred in the kitchen, the scrape of a spoon in a clay bowl, served after vespers to those who had fasted. Even in silence, milk spoke. In villages, its sounds echoed through alleys and yards, the splash of churning, rhythmic and almost hypnotic, the swish of butter being worked by hand, the sudden laughter when cream spilled or curd jumped from the press. On market days, milk travelled. Women walked with covered pails, sloshing gently with each step. Traders snapped lids open to test the smell. Buyers clinked coins on the stall table. A sound sharp and final. Milk wasn't shouted about. It was murmured. Even its trade language was soft, a ladle, a scoop, a pour. Measures of flow, not weight. The language of mothers, not merchants. And yet, it built markets. In towns like Rouen or Bruges, early morning streets echoed with the steps of dairy sellers, many of them women calling their goods in sing-song tones. Not loudly, just enough to be heard by those still drowsy behind shutters. Sweet milk, fresh today. Curds and cream. Come taste, come try. The rhythm of milk shaped the hours. Morning was for milking and porridge. Midday for curdling and churning. Evening for skimming and stirring. Night for cleaning, cooling, storing. In homes with goats or sheep, the rhythm was even more delicate. Shorter cycles, smaller yields, but always the same soundscape, gentle, repetitive, grounding. And when the milk was gone, the silence was loud. A cow gone dry. A goat lost to illness. A pail overturned. These were not just losses, they were absences in the music of daily life. Children noticed first. No splash in their bowl, no butter on their bread, no churn to help stir, and parents felt it in their bones. The day stretched longer. The work, heavier. The silence, more profound. Even grief had its milk. In some regions, morning households were brought bowls of warm milk and honey, not for celebration, but for grounding, something gentle to hold in the mouth, to remind the body that life still flowed. Milk was presence, even when not seen, even when not tasted. It was the background hum of medieval life, a rhythm as steady as the bell, as grounding as the earth. It whispered, "You are fed, you are held, you are part of the song." And next, we'll visit the tales milk left behind. The legends, the folklore, the stories that carried its meaning into memory of rivers turned to milk, of saints with milk in their hands, of creatures who drank from milky pools beneath the moon. Because in the medieval world, milk didn't just nourish the body, it fed the story. We follow milk beyond the table, beyond the pasture, even beyond the painted walls into the realm of story. Because in the medieval world, milk didn't end at the pail. It slipped quietly into myth, into songs, prayers, warnings, and dreams. Tonight, we explore the legends of milk. Let's begin with the River of Milk. In several parts of medieval Europe, especially in Irish and Breton folklore, there were whispered tales of hidden rivers, underground streams of milk that only the pure in heart could see. Some said they flowed beneath old monastic sites. Others placed them deep in forests, guarded by spirits or saints. It was said that if you ever found such a river, you must not drink greedily. A single sip, cupped by hand, could bless a child, heal a wound, or feed the starving. But to fill a vessel, to try and hoard it, that was forbidden. The river would vanish. The luck would turn. Such tales taught more than wonder. They taught reverence. They reminded listeners that milk was not to be wasted, that nourishment was sacred, that greed could sour even the sweetest gift. Then there were the saints. Saint Brigid, whom we've met before, was at the heart of many such stories. One tale says that when she was a child, she could not drink from her mother's breast. She would only feed from a cow, gentle and white, sent by an angel. Another says that her touch could bring forth milk from a barren cow, even in winter. In her monastery, dairy work was considered holy. The butter churned by her nuns was sent to the poor, wrapped in linen and prayer. Brigid's feast, the 1st of February, was celebrated with dairy-rich meals, flans, cheeses, curds sweetened with honey. In some places, girls carried small jugs of milk in processions, blessing doorways and fields. And then there were darker tales. In alpine regions, folk spoke of the Milchfrau, the milkwoman. She was neither saint nor witch, but something in between. Sometimes she came to bless a household, leaving a pail of milk on the doorstep after a prayer. Other times, she punished greed, curdling milk or drying cows if her gifts were disrespected. It was said that if you left her a bowl of cream on the first night of May, your cows would give well all summer. But if you forgot, the milk would turn blue. In Slavic lands, milk was tied to the domovoi, a household spirit who lived behind the stove or in the rafters. He protected the family if honoured, but caused mischief if ignored. A splash of milk was often poured behind the hearth for him each morning. A silent thank you, a peace offering. And if milk spilled by accident, some believed it meant the domovoi was angry. Others said it was the spirit's way of taking his share. Stories like these weren't just entertainment. They were guides. They taught children to respect animals, to be careful with food, to trust in things unseen. They wrapped practical wisdom in magic, making memory sweeter and rules easier to follow. There were tales of milky pools where lovers met, of fairies who bathed in warm milk by moonlight, leaving dew in return, of dragons who demanded milk instead of gold. In Icelandic sagas, milk was a gift to trolls left on stones near caves to keep them from stealing sheep. In Italy, children were told stories of the latte notturno, the night milk. If a baby cried after dark and no milk could be found, a quiet knock at the door might reveal a cloaked figure with a small jug. You must thank her gently, take only what you need, and never ask her name. Some said she was an angel, others a wandering soul, but all agreed her milk healed. Even in medieval bestiaries, those strange and poetic collections of animal law milk appeared as symbol. The unicorn, for instance, was said to lay its head in a maiden's lap and sleep. And if milk was present, It would drink, then vanish pure, meeting pure. Goats were praised for their clarity. Their milk, while less creamy than cows, was considered closer to human milk and better for infants. It was said that a goat who gave freely was a blessing, but one who kicked the pail was under a curse. There were prayers, too. Old rhymes whispered as milk was poured. Flow sweet, flow sure, from cow to bowl, from hearth to cure. Spill not, spoil not, turn not blue. Blessed be this gift so true. Not official prayers, not Latin, but real and remembered, because in the medieval world, stories were how truth was passed down. Not dates or doctrines, but meaning, feeling, wisdom, and milk so humble, so daily, so easily overlooked became one of the oldest symbols of kindness, of care, of what we share. Tonight, as we turn down the lanterns and tuck ourselves under blankets, it's comforting to imagine those same stories told long ago, around peat fires, beneath oak beams, with a bowl of warm milk in hand. Tales passed from grandmother to child, from ploughman to daughter, from nun to novice, because milk wasn't just a thing, it was a story. And next, we'll turn toward the body itself, how milk shaped health, strength, and even beauty in medieval thought, from remedies and recipes to beliefs about its humours. We'll explore the ways people understood what milk did inside us. Because in the medieval world, milk wasn't only external, it lived within. We step inward. Into the quiet chambers of medieval thought, where the body was a delicate balance, and every bite, every sip, every texture had meaning. We're diving into how milk was seen not just as food, but as medicine. As fuel for health, a tool of healing, and a mirror to the soul's balance. Because in the medieval world, milk didn't stop at the lips. It travelled deeper into the blood, into the breath, into the humours. Let's begin with the theory of the four humours, central to medieval medicine, and inherited from ancient Greek and Roman thought. The body, they believed, was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each humour had a temperament: hot, cold, wet, dry. Health was the result of balance among them. Illness, an excess or deficiency. And milk? Milk was seen as cold and moist, like phlegm, but not as heavy. It was gentle, nourishing, and suited to those who were warm and dry by nature, children, for example, or the elderly, whose bodies were cooling with age. Doctors praised it, cautiously. In moderation, milk soothed inflammation, restored strength, and softened the gut. It was often prescribed for fevers, for the sick recovering from bloodletting, or for women who had recently given birth. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess and mystic, wrote that milk from happy animals carried more vitality. She recommended goat's milk for cleansing the liver, cow's milk for nourishing the flesh, and sheep's milk for strengthening the lungs. But milk had its limits. Too much, or taken at the wrong time, was thought to cause sluggishness, to increase phlegm, to cloud the mind. Monks who studied long hours were warned not to drink too much milk in the evenings; it might disturb their dreams. Still, milk appeared in many remedies. Warm milk with honey for coughs, milk with crushed fennel or anise for digestion, milk infused with rue or lavender to calm nerves. In some herbals, milk was boiled with ashes of deer antler for strength. In others, mixed with rose water and barley to reduce fevers. Midwives, who held practical knowledge far deeper than many physicians, used milk in postpartum care. Cloths, soaked in warm milk, were placed on the abdomen to soothe cramping. A few drops of goat's milk were given to infants with colic, and for those who could not eat solid food, whether from age, illness, or sorrow, milk was a godsend. Warm, simple, soft, a bridge between hunger and healing. There were even cleansing fasts made entirely of milk. In some monastic traditions, certain days allowed only milk and bread, not as punishment, but as restoration, as a way to calm the body and prepare the soul. And milk, of course, appeared in beauty. Though medieval beauty routines were not elaborate by modern standards, they did exist, especially among noble women and courtiers. Milk was believed to soften skin, brighten the complexion, and ease blemishes. A popular recipe for a facial wash combined milk with crushed almonds and rose petals. Another, for softening hands, mixed milk with honey and a little vinegar. In Venice, milk baths were whispered about luxuries reserved for the wealthiest, or the vainest. In France, milk was steeped with violets and strained for use as a scented lotion. But even peasant women used milk for comfort. A rag soaked in warm whey eased a tired brow. A splash of buttermilk cooled sunburn. A dab of curds on a bee sting brought relief. Milk was not glamour, it was tenderness. Even in sickness, it comforted. For those nearing the end of life, a bowl of milk and honey might be the final nourishment taken. It warmed the throat, it eased pain. It spoke of childhood, of gentleness, of return, and in some monastic hospices, it was recorded that dying monks were offered milk as their last earthly food, a reminder of divine care, simple and pure. Tonight, as we sit with our own aches and weariness, it's comforting to think of milk not only as a substance, but as a kind of care language. Something humble that said, "I see your pain, I want to ease it." Whether it was a mother cooling a fever, a monk tending the weak, or a farmer handing a cup to a hungry traveller, milk was a balm. Its warmth carried meaning, its softness carried hope. And next, we'll explore the economy of milk, how it was traded, taxed, counted, and fought over. How a humble ladle of cream could mean favour or feud. How dairies became engines of survival and ambition. Because in the medieval world, milk was not just healing, it was currency. We open the ledgers not of kings or merchants, but of households, farms, and quiet dairies tucked between fields and forest. Because milk, so simple and familiar, was also a force in the economy, a means of trade, a form of rent, a measure of power. Tonight, we count in ladles and curds. We walk into the dairy economy of the medieval world. Let's begin with the basics. Milk itself was rarely sold fresh, especially in rural areas. It spoiled quickly and was hard to transport without turning. But what milk became butter, cheese, curds was another matter entirely. These were durable, valuable, and deeply sought after. Butter could be salted and stored. Cheese, aged and traded. Cream, skimmed and poured, was a luxury even nobles prized. A well-run dairy could turn a single cow's yield into coin, and in many households, it was the women, mothers, daughters, grandmothers, who handled this work. The dairy wife was no small figure. She tracked the flow of milk through seasons, managed the churn, negotiated trades, and knew which cheese wheel needed turning when. Her skill fed her family, but also positioned her as a quiet economic force in the village. And villages, in turn, had markets. Local market days, often once or twice a week, brought traders from miles around. Butter was sold in wooden pats or wrapped in cloth. Cheese appeared in rounds or wedges, often with small signs carved into their rinds to show origin or maker. Prices varied with the seasons. In spring, milk was plentiful, and dairy prices dipped. In winter, with animals dry or yields low, even a small pat of butter might fetch a handsome price. And butter, curiously, was taxed. In parts of medieval England and France, towns imposed a butter tax, a levy on all butter sold within market stalls. In some places, a portion of every wheel of cheese was set aside for the local lord. These cheese tithes were not just tradition, they were written into law. If you failed to pay, your right to graze or sell might be revoked. Even monasteries participated. Their dairies were vast, run with quiet precision. Monks kept records not only of spiritual matters, but of milk yields, butter churned, cheese aged. Some of these accounts still survive scrolls listing goats by name, cows by temperament, and wheels of cheese by weight and taste. In exchange for these goods, monasteries received coin, spices, linen, and sometimes influence. To gift a nobleman a fine cheese aged in your abbey, perfumed with herbs, was to curry favour. To supply butter for the bishop's table, a mark of honour. And then there was rent. Yes, rent paid in milk. Especially in the countryside, many tenant farmers owed not just grain or labour, but dairy. A certain number of cheese rounds per season, a weight of butter each feast day. This practice, called dairy rent, was common across the British Isles, Scandinavia, and parts of Germany. It wasn't just obligation, it was a relationship. If the butter was good, the landlord smiled more kindly. If the cheese crumbled, so might your lease. And so, care was taken. Even among peasants, reputation mattered. A woman whose butter kept longer, whose cheese had no mould, became trusted, favoured. Visited first on market days, invited to barter during lean seasons. In some places, her name became shorthand. Is this Mary's butter? Yes, you can taste it. The same quiet pride that coloured paintings with milk also filled these exchanges. Not loud, not flashy, but deeply respected. And this economy wasn't limited to local stalls. In alpine valleys, cheese wheels travelled by mule to distant towns. In Flanders, monks sold butter to passing merchants. In Sweden, barrels of whey were traded for salt or smoked fish. And then, of course, came the fines. Yes, milk could be illegal, or at least mismanaged. In some cities, milk sellers needed licenses. To sell adulterated milk watered down, spoiled, or left uncovered could lead to public scolding or even a fine. In London's dairies, inspectors were known to visit early, testing milk for purity. Bad sellers might be banned from the market entirely. Cleanliness mattered, and not just for health but for trust. Because milk, once spoiled, spoiled more than the belly. It spoiled the bond. Yet for all its risks, milk endured as currency. It was used in dowries, cheese wheels counted alongside blankets and tools. It was given as gifts to midwives, priests, and neighbours in need. It marked seasons and settled debts, and in times of feast or famine, milk found its place. During bountiful summers, villagers might offer extra butter to the church, to be distributed among the poor. During famine, dried cheese scraps and old curds were passed from hand to hand, small treasures of nourishment. Because in the end, milk held more than nutrition. It held community. A neighbour who shared a ladle of cream said more than words could. A cheese placed quietly at a widow's door meant, you're not alone. A market woman handing a curd to a child meant, here, grow strong. Tonight, as we pause in our own kitchens, perhaps with a glass of milk or slice of cheese, it's worth remembering the countless hands that once made trade from cream, who measured wealth not in coins, but in care. Because in the medieval world, milk wasn't just economy, it was trust in motion. And next, we'll explore the seasons of milk, how its presence waxed and waned with the calendar, how festivals marked its flow, and how the wheel of the year turned with the churn. Because milk was never static, it followed the Sunday. We turn our gaze skyward, not just to the stars or the clouds, but to the slow and sacred rhythm of the medieval year. Because milk, like all things in village life, followed the seasons. Its flow marked time. Its absence deepened winter. Its return whispered of spring. Tonight, we follow milk through the calendar of the year. Let's begin where so many cycles did in early spring. With Imbolc, the Celtic festival later folded into the Christian feast of St. Brigid, celebrated on the 1st of February. It was not only a day of prayer, but a day of hope. By then, the worst of winter was hopefully behind. And the animals, after months of thin forage and deep cold, began to calve or kid. Goats, in particular, often gave birth around this time, offering the first fresh milk of the year. Even a cup of new milk was cause for celebration. Imbolc meant in the belly, a reference both to pregnancy and to promise. That what had been hidden was about to emerge, and so warm milk was poured on doorstep stones, A bowl was left outside overnight. For Bridget, they said, that she may bless the herd. Children, still pale from winter, were given the first curds, not sweet or soft, but tangy and strong, the taste of survival. Then came spring proper, March into May, the season of milk's return. As pastures greened, animals fed better. Their yield increased. The rhythm of milking became steady again, not just an act of care, but a return to abundance. Cheese-making began in earnest. Cellars reopened, old wheels were turned or cracked open, new ones pressed and salted, and the first churnings of butter were a joy. That soft gold, flecked with herbs or simply salted, was spread on barley cakes or traded in folded cloth. By Beltane, the festival of early May, milk was everywhere. This was the time when cattle were driven to higher pastures. In parts of Scotland, a ritual blessing of the herd included walking them between two fires and offering milk to the earth spirits. Bonfires were lit, butter cakes made, and every bite tasted of promise. Then came summer, the height of milk's generosity. June through August was the season of full yield. Milk flowed rich, especially from cows now heavy with green feed. Butter was churned daily. Cheeses were made in larger batches. In some places, especially in alpine and Nordic regions, families sent older children or women to temporary summer dairies. Small huts near high meadows, where they would live for weeks, tending animals and processing milk on site. This tradition, known as transhumance, was both labour and freedom. The songs sung by these summer herders still echo in old ballads, tales of love, loss, and lonely nights spent churning by moonlight. By Lammas, the 1st of August festival marking the first grain harvest, milk began to shift again. The heat dried the pastures. Animals grew restless. Butter, in the sun, softened too quickly. And so milk's abundance was preserved, cheese wheels hardened. Butter was buried in cool cellars. The dairy wife's days grew long, but every chore held a whisper of coming winter. Then came autumn, the retreat. September and October were for final preparations. Cows were brought home from the meadows. Goats, if not bred again, began to dry. Milk grew thinner, lighter, but no less loved. Now came the buttermilk soups, the warm curds in broth, the last feasts with cheese before it was locked away. At Michaelmas, late September, a symbolic wheel of cheese might be cut, offered to the poor, or shared among neighbours. And as winter approached, milk became memory. November and December held little fresh yield, but the butter from August, the cheeses from July, now became treasure. Yule feasts featured soft cheese melted over grains, butter wrapped in cloth and warmed by fire. A single bowl of sweet milk and honey shared by many was a rare delight. In some places, it was said that the Virgin Mary, in her flight to Egypt, carried a jug of milk wrapped in her cloak. On Christmas Eve, a spoon of milk left on the windowsill was said to bring luck for the coming year. And so, the wheel turned. And so, milk returned. Again and again. Not only a substance, but a season. Milk taught patience. That everything has its time. That absence isn't failure, it's rhythm. That winter gives meaning to spring. That hunger gives gratitude to taste. Tonight, as we feel the year winding toward its close or just beginning, depending on where you are in the world, we can still sense the echo of that cycle. A rhythm older than clocks, truer than calendars. A rhythm measured in yield, in silence, in return. And next, we'll explore the unseen labour behind milk, how hands, almost always women's hands, shaped every stage of its life. The tenderness, the toil, the unrecorded work of the dairy wife, the milkmaid, the mother, because milk didn't make itself, it was carried. We turn our gaze not to the milk, nor the animals who gave it, but to the hands that carried it, because behind every bowl of curds, every smear of butter, every whitewashed wall stood a woman, or a girl, or a grandmother, and always, her work was quiet. Tonight, We honour the dairy women of the medieval world. Let's begin in the early morning. The sky is still grey, the house still asleep. But one figure rises, wrapping herself in wool, pulling on wooden clogs. She walks to the byre or stable, where the cow waits, warm in the straw. She speaks to her gently, not loudly, just enough to be known. Then the milking begins. Pull and squeeze. Steady, patient. Not rushed, not harsh. The rhythm is second nature. She watches the cow's breath, the flick of her ears. She knows this animal knows when she's restless, when she's content, when her yield is low because the weather is wrong. When the pail is full, she lifts it not with a grand gesture, but with practiced grace. She carries it back across the yard, through the door, into the kitchen, where more work waits. She must strain the milk first through linen to remove hairs or stray straw, then skim it if cream is needed, or set it to clabber if curds are the goal, or heat it gently to begin a cheese. Each task has a time, and every day is different. If it's summer, she churns. The churn is not light. It demands time. Strength, repetition. If it's winter, she presses curds into a cloth-lined mould, ties the corners, places a weight on top, turns it later, checks for mould. If it's feast day, she stirs milk with herbs for a custard. If someone is ill, she warms it with honey. All this before breakfast. She might be young 12 perhaps, or 15, or she might be old, stooped from years of lifting, arms strong from labour. But always her work is central. In many medieval households, the dairy yard was the woman's domain. She knew which cow gave best milk, which goat kicked, which seasons demanded more salt in the butter. Her skill was often the difference between hunger and enough. But her name? Rarely written. Even in monastic records so precise, so detailed, we read of the dairy sister or the cheese nun. Never her given name. Her hands are everywhere, her voice nowhere. Still, she passed on her knowledge, from mother to daughter, aunt to niece, neighbour to neighbour, not in books, in action, in the way to warm the milk without scalding, the way to stir the curds without breaking, the way to coax butter from cream with rhythm, not force. In many regions, there were milk songs, short tunes passed down as both lullaby and instruction. A child stirring a pot might hum the same tune her grandmother did. A bride, moving to a new household, brought her butter mould with her, carved with her family's sign. These were her tools, not jewels, not silver, but a spoon worn smooth, a pail that didn't leak, a cloth tied just right, and more than tools, she brought presents. The dairy woman was often the one who comforted, who fed the orphan, who brought broth to the widow, who nursed the lamb too weak to stand. Her strength was not loud, and her labour, while overlooked, held communities together. Even in towns the pattern held. Milk sellers were often women. Walking long before sunrise, they carried pails on yokes, wrapped to keep the milk warm. They knew which doors wanted cream, which children liked curds, which houses needed a little extra, though they couldn't always pay. Sometimes their names were known. In late medieval London, records mention Alice the Darewoman, fined for selling milk past curfew, or Margaret Butterhand, praised in parish notes for feeding hungry orphans during a harsh Lent. Small mentions, but they point to lives of steady care. And always, behind the names, were the hands, cracked in winter, rinsed in cold streams, stained from herbs and salt, hands that fed and stirred and held. Tonight, when we think of milk, we must think of her. Not just the woman in the field, but the girl learning beside her. The elder who hums while she stirs. The friend who brings cheese in a cloth on a sorrowful day. Because in the medieval world, Milk didn't appear by magic. It was earned. And next, we'll look at the shadows. What happened when milk went wrong? When it curdled too soon? When cows dried early? When rumours whispered of witchcraft and envy? When the milkmaid was not praised but blamed? Because milk, for all its softness, had danger too. We drift into deeper shadows. Into the corners of the barn where lanterns flicker. Into the kitchen where milk won't set. Into the eyes of neighbours narrowed in silence. Because for all its gentleness, milk was not immune to fear. Tonight, we explore what happened when milk went wrong. Let's begin with the signs. A pail of milk, fresh from the cow, that curdled too fast. Butter that refused to rise. No matter how long it was churned. A cow who'd been healthy one morning, and by evening, gave nothing but watery froth. These were not just inconveniences. They were omens. In a world where milk was life, where it measured security, health, and dignity, its sudden loss brought not just hunger, but unease, questions, suspicions. Was something done to the cow? Did someone cross our threshold with ill intent? Have we been cursed? And slowly, eyes turned, often to women, to the quiet neighbour with the lopsided smile, to the old widow who walked barefoot to church, to the milkmaid who sang too sweetly, whose butter was always perfect. The line between skill and sorcery was thin, too thin, and so began the whispers. She bewitched my churn. I saw her sprinkle something by the fence. She walks at dawn, alone. Who does that? In parts of Europe, especially in the late Middle Ages, accusations of milk magic grew more common. This wasn't just witchcraft in the grand, fiery sense we imagine. It was folk fear, local suspicion, a nervousness about what could not be explained. If someone's cows dried while another's flourished, it must be theft. Not of animals, but of milk force. Folk tradition in places like Germany and Scandinavia tells of milk hares creatures sent by witches to suckle cows at night, stealing their yield. These hares were said to be familiars, conjured through spells. If a cow gave less milk and was found trembling in the morning, some would claim she'd been ridden by such a beast. To prevent this, farmers placed iron nails above stalls, hung rowan branches on the gate, or smeared a ring of ash around the pail before milking. Every village had its charms, its cures. In the Baltics, if butter refused to come, a woman might heat a horseshoe and dip it in the cream to burn away the spell, they said. In the Alps, a failed batch of cheese might be broken apart and buried under the moon. In Cornwall, milk poured over a red-hot coal was said to scare the devil out. These rituals were not done in jest. They were acts of desperation, of protection, because when milk went wrong, it disrupted more than breakfast. It threatened the year, and sometimes these fears turned cruel. Accusations led to punishment. Not always public trials, though those did happen, but social exile. Refusal to buy a woman's butter. Children warned not to touch her pail. Gossip that outlasted the winter. In some cases, women confessed whether from pressure, guilt, or fear. Yes, they said, I stole her milk, but what they'd really stolen, perhaps, was luck, or hard-earned skill mistaken for unnatural gift. Even midwives were sometimes caught in the snare. If a child was born weak and could not nurse, and the cow's milk soured the same day, it was all too easily spun into a tale of malice. The connection between mother's milk and cow's milk was more than symbolic. They were linked. Milk was milk. Its failure, personal. Its loss, a kind of grief. But not all stories ended in fear. Some spoke of healing. A family whose milk had failed asked the village wise woman for help. She offered no curse, no potion, just advice. Burn juniper beneath the cow's hooves. Let the child touch the udder. Leave a bowl of curds at the crossroads. Whether from comfort or coincidence, the milk returned, and with it, peace. Because belief could cut both ways. It could blame, but it could also restore. And so, milk became a mirror, reflecting the village's fears, its envy, its hope, its desire to control what could not be explained. Tonight, as we sit in a world shaped by science, refrigeration, and pasteurization, it's easy to forget how fragile milk once was, how intimate, how exposed, how a single spoiled bowl could turn neighbors into accusers. But perhaps, deep down, we still understand that when something so nourishing falters, it shakes more than hunger, it shakes trust. And next, we'll return to warmth, to the places where milk brought people together, feast tables, weddings, baptisms, holy days, where milk was offered in joy, not fear, because in the medieval world, even after the storm, milk still meant celebration. We return to the hearth, to the moments of light, because while milk had its dangers and shadows, it also danced brightly at the center of joy. It wasn't just survival, it was celebration marking beginnings, blessings, and bonds. Tonight, we pour a bowl for joy. Let's begin with weddings. In many regions across medieval Europe, a wedding feast was not complete without milk dishes. Not just for nourishment, but for symbolism. Milk, white and pure, represented new beginnings, fertility, peace, the hope of a sweet life together. In parts of Ireland and Brittany, a small bowl of cream was passed between the bride and groom before the ceremony. Each took a sip, a gesture older than the church itself, a pact made in milk, not wine. The feast that followed might include curd tarts, soft cheese with honey, or custards thickened with egg and milk, rich and soft, warm and filling. In Eastern Europe, guests might offer gifts of butter wrapped in linen or cheese moulded with flowers. And in the Alps, a newlywed couple might carry a wooden bowl of fresh milk to the door of their new home. The bride would pour it across the threshold to bless the foundation and invite abundance. Then there were births. When a child was born, milk was everywhere. The mother's milk, of course, watched with hope, guarded with prayers, but also cow's milk, goat's milk, in a bowl by the bed, to warm the room, to feed the mother, to anoint the child if needed. In parts of Italy and southern France, a spoon of sweetened milk was touched to the baby's lips as a first taste of the world. In Norse tradition, milk was offered to the household spirits to protect the newborn. A few drops left on the hearthstone or threshold, and then came the naming feasts. These weren't always formal baptisms. In many small villages, a child's name was shared at a simple meal among kin. And what better to serve than the softest food? Cream with barley, fresh cheese and stewed fruit, milk puddings dusted with cinnamon if the family had means, the sound of laughter, the weight of a sleeping baby, the spoon dipped and lifted, again and again. Then there were the feast days of saints. Saint Bridget, as you might expect, was honoured with dairy. On her day, the 1st of February, bowls of milk were set on windowsills. Children stirred butter while singing old rhymes. Cheese and oatcakes were shared around the fire. In monasteries dedicated to her name, monks poured milk over the cloister's threshold at dawn, whispering blessings as they walked. In Germany and the Low Countries, Michaelmas brought cheese festivals. Wheels of summer-aged cheese were cracked open, shared with the poor, gifted to neighbours. In England, the Assumption of Mary was sometimes marked with a sweet curd dish, white, soft, and gently spiced. A tribute to the mother's milk believed to have nourished the Christ child. And let's not forget the harvest. At Lammas, when grain came in, milk was part of nearly every dish. It softened crusty bread. It moistened grain porridge. It rounded out the flavour of stews and made even bitter greens sweet. Farmers poured milk into the soil at the field's edge, a gift back to the land, a circle completed. Even holy days of fasting, when meat was forbidden, often allowed dairy. Monks prepared meals of milk broth, cheese with leeks, buttered peas. Simple, yes, but deeply satisfying. And in moments of joy that weren't religious, say, a good harvest, or the return of a son from war, milk was served warm, mixed with ale or mead, a drink called posset. It was thick, creamy, spiced, and passed from hand to hand as tales were told and songs were sung. One jug, one ladle, many smiles, and beyond all formal celebration was the quiet joy of togetherness. A family gathered at dawn with steaming bowls. A weary traveller offered milk and bread by a stranger. A shepherd sipping from his flask in the hills, watching the stars blink into being. These were not grand feasts, but they were feasts of the soul. And milk, always, was there, softening sorrow, rounding the edge of hunger, warming the heart. Tonight, as we think of joy, not the loud, flashing kind, but the kind that settles into the bones, we see again how milk held it. In bowls, in cups, in cloth-wrapped curds, in laughter, in blessing, in presence. And next, we turn our gaze toward the legacy, what milk left behind, not only in recipes or ruins, but in memory. In the stories whispered at hearths, the customs folded into modern kitchens, the soft echo of something both humble and holy, because milk didn't disappear. It became part of us. We listen for echoes, not loud, not obvious, but soft ones. The kind that live in kitchens, in habits passed without question, in the quiet comfort of a warm drink at night. Because though we've left the medieval village behind, milk has not left us. Tonight, we trace the legacy of milk across time. Let's begin with what remains most clearly. The recipes. Across Europe, from the British Isles to the far corners of the Alps, medieval milk dishes have survived in some form, though modern kitchens rarely know their roots. The simple custard milk, eggs, sugar, and spice is nearly identical to what a medieval cook would prepare for a feast. Often called blancmanger, it was made with rice or barley, sometimes even chicken, thickened to a smooth cream and perfumed with rosewater or almond. The buttery tarts served on feast days, they echo the cheese pies of monastic kitchens. Even the humble porridge, now made with oats and cow's milk, carries the soul of early dairy grain dishes, some sweetened with honey, others seasoned with herbs or onion, depending on what was available. In rural villages across Ireland and Scotland, the art of buttermilk bread, soda bread remains. Its tang is not only from science, but from tradition, from generations who knew how to turn leftovers from the churn into nourishment. Then there's the rituals. We may not pour milk on doorsteps for Bridget anymore, but the idea of milk as blessing, as comfort, still here, still real. We offer milk to the grieving. We serve warm milk to children before sleep. We stir it into tea, into soup, into the hands of those we love. We don't call it sacred, but it is. We carry dairy in holidays too. Cheese plates at Christmas, custards at Easter, milk-sweetened coffee as we watch the snow. In ways quiet and constant, milk is still part of celebration, still a vessel of care. And the tools? In some attics, old butter molds still rest, carved with flowers, initials, symbols. In some kitchens, linen cloths are still folded in just the same way grandmothers once used to strain curds. The churn may be gone, but the gesture remains. Even our language holds echoes, milking it to draw something out slowly, thoroughly. Mother's milk, not just nourishment, but something natural, native, right. To cry over spilled milk, a lesson in letting go, passed down through centuries. Even the phrase, the milk of human kindness, from Shakespeare's pen, draws on the image of milk as gentleness, compassion, nurture, because milk was never just food, it was a symbol, and symbols last. They last in kitchens, in lullabies, in stories passed by candlelight, in how we hold a bowl with both hands, in how we look for warmth when the world feels cold, and in how we remember a time when milk painted walls, marked seasons, built trust, and whispered blessing. A time when a woman's whole pride could rest in a single perfect pat of butter, when a child's comfort was the warmth of a clay bowl, held close to the lips, when joy tasted like cream, and grief was soothed with curds and honey. That world may seem far away, but it's not lost. It lives in us, in our memories, in our mouths, in our gestures. Every time we heat milk on a cold morning, every time we stir, or strain, or spread, every time we say this is comfort. Tonight, we remember not only the people, but the pattern, the rhythm, the care, the hands, because milk, in the end, was not about cows or cream or currency. It was about connection. And as we prepare for the final chapter of our journey, we'll step back through all we've seen to understand why this story matters. Why something as simple as milk, humble, daily, overlooked, can tell us so much about who we were and who we still are. We arrived gently at the end of our journey, a journey that began with a question about painted houses and led us through kitchens, barns, altars, and memory, through silence and song, blessing and burden. Tonight, we gather what we've learned not as facts, but as feeling, because milk, as we've seen, was never just a substance. It was a thread, a white thread, stitching together life in the medieval world. Let's begin where we started, those strange, milk-painted walls. Now we know they weren't strange at all. They were practical. Yes, lime-washed and sealed with casein, a gift from the dairy pail, but also symbolic, tactile, a way to honour the milk that gave so much. From there, we wandered into daily life where milking was rhythm, where curds were comfort, where churns sang with labour and pride. We saw how women, mostly unnoticed by history, shaped survival with their hands. Not with glory, not with noise, but with quiet constancy. We felt the weight of the seasons, the deep joy of the first spring milk, the stillness of the dairy cellars in August, the hush of the empty pails in January when winter asked patience. We listened to stories passed down not just of saints and spirits, but of milk rivers and midnight gifts, of creatures who stole cream and charms that protected the pail. We learned of fear, too, how milk could curdle not just on the tongue, but in the heart, how suspicion took root, how kindness could be mistaken for cunning, how loss, when unexplained, turned neighbour against neighbour, but always we returned to joy, to milk at weddings, milk at births, milk at holy tables and humble ones, to butter wrapped in linen, cheese carved with care, to the woman who rose before dawn not for praise, but for peace, to feed, to tend, to hold the thread. And here, in the soft closing of our tale, we pause, because something in this story speaks beyond its time. It reminds us that the smallest things, those taken for granted, are often the richest sources of meaning. That nourishment isn't just food. It's memory, intention, the feeling of being cared for, even in silence. It reminds us that labour doesn't need to be loud to be sacred. That comfort comes not from abundance, but from enough. From a warm bowl, a steady hand, a rhythm you can trust. Tonight, wherever you are, whether listening in a quiet room or drifting into dreams, know this. The story of medieval milk is your story too. Not because you churn butter or paint with curds, but because you know what it is to seek comfort, to honour care, to carry something fragile and precious, day after day, with tenderness. That is what milk taught them, and still teaches us. So, rest now. Let the rhythm of old churns echo softly in the dark. Let the scent of warm hay and sweet cream drift through your thoughts, and let this white thread, spun across centuries, hold you gently as you sleep. Thank you for walking this path with me. Sleep well. You are held. You are nourished. You are home.